the Rude Awakening Tour podcast.
Seats, Spark Seats.
It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Rude Awakening Tour podcast, Dr. Nevin. Welcome, and I'm in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and welcome to Michigan. We're in beautiful St. Clair, Michigan, in St. Clair County. It's hard for the audience to appreciate this, but out this beautiful window is the St. Clair River with Lambton County, Ontario, just beyond. We've been watching the freighters go up and down the river. So hope you like it. It's almost like being in Canada here in Michigan.
Yeah, and we can see Canada too from just across.
That's right.
The river.
Those are $1 million Canadian homes there. You see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you still have your place out east, or?
Oh, right. So
I'm because my question is kind of where are you?
Yeah.
So,
what are we doing here? what are we doing in Michigan, as opposed to Vermont, where we have been?
Yeah.
For quite some time. So as of the new year, I became a resident of Michigan, formally relocated from Vermont, where I had lived for over 6 years. You may be familiar with this, but just to recap. So when I finished my training after I got out of the Army, I went back to Hopkins, and I did some additional training there for a number of years. And by mid-2017, I was all done, looking for a place to settle down and do my consulting work and research, and ultimately set up the Quineism Foundation. And I settled on Vermont because I've always wanted to live there. It's a very, very nice place, great hiking, good skiing, beautiful nature. So we set up the foundation in White River Junction, Vermont, as of January 2018. We were there for a full 6 years, and Vermont's been wonderful. I enjoyed it very much. I was in a small farmhouse during most of the recent unpleasantness with coronavirus. But recently, a number of things have happened that made us want to move. So my family's originally from Toronto. You may know that.
Nice. Yeah.
And my father passed away not too long ago, leaving my mother all alone there in our childhood home in Toronto. Yeah. So that made me think I needed to be closer to home. And then my longtime girlfriend, she's from the Chicago area, and she has family there that she wants to be closer to. So we just decided that it'd be good to leave Vermont and move somewhere in the Midwest. We were looking at Ohio. We were looking at Michigan. But then a part-time job opened up with the health department here in St. Clair County. They were needing a medical director to do public health work for the county. And that made our decision for us. We decided this is the perfect spot. And so I started working remotely last summer. And then once we moved here over the holidays, have worked there on a permanent basis, but just part time. Don't worry, I still have plenty of time to commit to our work with the Quineism Foundation and my research and consulting work, and that's how I spend most of my time still.
Yeah, nice. So, and you already kind of alluded, but you're originally from Toronto.
Yeah, that's right. I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada. I come from the west end of Toronto. For folks that are familiar with the town, close to High Park, is where I was raised. Now, of course, my father's not from Canada. My father's from Buffalo, New York, ran across the border. And he moved up to Toronto during the war, the Vietnam War. Married my mother. She was from a small town in Ontario, and had my sister, and then myself. So my sister and I have known since we were young children that we were dual citizens by nature of our birth. So I knew, and my sister knew, growing up, that we could either live in Canada our whole lives or move to the States, as circumstances might permit. And so, after I actually dropped out of high school when I was a teenager, and I spent a number of years working as what I playfully describe as a carny. I wasn't actually a carny. I worked for an amusement park that was fixed, not mobile.
Some people are scared of carnies.
Well, there's no reason to be afraid of me. This was a children's amusement park on the islands in downtown Toronto. I worked there, I think, for 4 years, 4 summers and some of the winters. And got my fill of blue collar work. I definitely got my hands greasy and dirty. And one day, I must have been out in the sun all day running the rides, and I realized, maybe working in an air-conditioned building might be nice. And so it was around that time I decided I'm going to be a doctor. And I thought about joining the military. I thought about joining the Canadian military, but ultimately I realized I wanted to live in the States for a number of reasons. So I decided I'm going to join the U.S. military. And then I suppose I realized at some point that the U.S. military could pay for my medical training, which I wanted to complete. So after I finished college, I went back to high school, finished that up very quickly. Um, Burned through college quite fast. I took night courses, summer courses, got that done in short order. And then when it was time to apply to medical school, I applied to only one. I applied to the military's medical school in Bethesda, Maryland, got accepted, and moved down to the United States. It was
And
kind
that was what year? 98?
let's see, that would have been 95. That would have been in summer of 95.
Huh.
Yeah, it was kind of funny crossing the border because I remember the border guard here was asking me what I was doing coming into the States. And I said, well, I just joined the Army and I'm going to medical school and I'm going to live here. So that's how I moved here and started my career as a military physician. And then, of course, once I finished once you finish your medical school, once you finish your 4 years of medical school, you have to choose a specialty. And for a number of reasons, I suppose because I'd always liked numbers. I did math and physics in college, and I've always been attracted to statistics and analysis. I suppose in retrospect, I probably should have been an engineer, but regardless, I decided that I was going to do preventive medicine or public health medicine,
Yep.
which includes a lot of work in epidemiology and biostatistics. So it was a perfect match for me. So after internship down in North Carolina at Fort Bragg, I'm not sure what Fort Bragg is called now,
Yeah, they changed all the names.
Fort
Yeah.
Liberty or Independence or
Yeah.
something like that. Anyway, after my internship there, I went to Johns Hopkins. They sent me there for a year to do a master's degree in public health, and then I finished up at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. I did a residency in public health there, and then I began my military career in public health in earnest, and accepting that offer of free education through the military and all of the free education that residency training affords. I had a full ride at Hopkins and so on. You incur a significant service commitment doing that. So essentially, I served 10 years on active duty in the U.S. Army, paying off that service commitment. And it was, in retrospect, just an absolutely fantastic time. It gave me everything I have today. Most of all, of course, it gave me my interest in Mefloquine. I hadn't really given the drug much thought prior to being deployed over to Afghanistan. This would have been in right at the start of 2007. Now, during medical school, I'd gone to airborne school. I'd become a 5-jump chump and done another of other things.
Congratulations.
Oh, I thank you.
From one
appreciate that.
jumper to another.
Well, it's really not much to congratulate me for. I'll tell you a story later about my first jump. But unfortunately, I survived. I didn't die. I didn't do anything too stupid, and I got my wings. But that's obviously that combination of being airborne qualified and being a public health doctor put me top of the roster when the 82nd Airborne Division was deploying to Afghanistan. So this was started 2007. 82nd was taken over the command there of U.S. forces, of most U.S. forces. So I got selected to be the public health doctor on that deployment.
Yeah.
Now we're deploying to Afghanistan, which is theoretically a malaria endemic area. So here we are in December or January 2007, and they're handing out malaria pills. They're handing out Mefloquine, and I distinctly recall we were all in I think it's called the green room. I think it's still called that. It's that shack where normally if you're jumping, you'd get all your kit on, right? Yeah. But in this case, we just had our duffel bags and stuff, and we were waiting for the commercial plane to take us over. And as we were going out the gate, going towards the plane, they had us reach into these big garbage bags. And in the garbage bags were these boxes of Mefloquine. And they had been prescribed. They had a roster of all of us, of course, and so the prescriptions had somebody's name on them, but the box I picked up did not have my name on it. It was some private or something whose name was on the box. And we were told, oh, it's all the same. It's all, everyone's getting the same drug. It's no big deal. So in the middle of January, as we were landing in Bagram with snow on the ground, we all started taking our Mefloquine. And of course, I'm the public health doctor. I had no role in this decision, but I did bring it up with my boss. I said, this is probably not necessary at this point. There aren't many mosquitoes at Bagram in January.
When there's snow on the ground.
When there's snow on the ground, right. And even when there's no snow on the ground, there's really not a lot of mosquitoes. But the reasoning I was told motivated this decision is, well, just to be safe. We don't know when the mosquitoes are going to start biting. We don't know when the malaria risk is actually going to start. So we may as well just start now, because why not? Right. So that was the level of confidence that the military, as exemplified by the 82nd Airborne, had in Mefloquine at that time. They thought it was so safe that they could just give it to anyone, right, regardless of what other medical conditions they might have. And it was so safe that you can just start giving it in January, even though you may not need to actually be using it for months.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, we had a lot of other things going on in Afghanistan, so I didn't give it much thought, right, at first, compared to all the other problems that we were having. And I really started thinking about Mefloquine when our gate guard died. If you can believe this, we had a really nice fellow. He was guarding the gate to the jock compound. So I would always say hi to him every time I was leaving for the chow hall and coming back. And he was just the nicest guy. And one day we heard he was dead. He just died in his sleep. Something happened. He had some kind of seizure or something, and didn't know what was going on. And I was asked to look into circumstances surrounding his death a little bit, as were some other people. And I believe, and I may be mistaken here, the facts might be a little unclear with so many years passing, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there was something about his medical history that caught my eye, and I realized he probably shouldn't have been given Mefloquine, right?
Yeah.
And I started looking into that and asking some questions, and I was very quickly, not explicitly told, but it was made very clear to me that it would be best if I stopped asking questions. You know how the military can be, right? And that probably had the opposite effect, because I realized, wait a second, something is going on. First of all, by this point, I'd realized that a lot of my deployed service members were on all sorts of drugs. I was working with some young lady who apparently had a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, and she was deployed. What is going on with that? I thought. And then any number of people were on various psychotropic drugs, antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs. And I thought the conditions that these drugs are prescribed for, depression, anxiety, what have you, are generally contraindicating to deployment. These don't meet deployment standards. And then I realized, wait a second, all of these people are on Mefloquine. And even though at this point, I wasn't yet of the opinion that the drug was inherently dangerous, or that it somehow wasn't unsuitable for just regular healthy folks, I did know, and everyone in the military knew, that you weren't supposed to give this drug to folks with certain mental health problems, or who might have epilepsy or other neurological problems. It's right there on the label. This is not controversial stuff. So then I realized we have a problem, right? Whether or not the Mefloquine contributed to this poor fellow's death or not, I suppose we'll never know. But I realized we had a problem, because we weren't using the drug in accordance with the manufacturer's guidance. And we weren't using the drug in accordance with even the Army's guidance. Right? Surgeon General had said, don't give this to people who are depressed, or don't give this drug to people who have mental health problems. So how did this happen? Right? So while I was there in Afghanistan, I did a few studies. I had access to data. I had access to record systems. And I talked to my boss and I said, look, can I at least look into this, see how bad this problem is? And fortunately, I was allowed to proceed. And from that came a paper that I later published, where I basically looked at all the U.S. personnel that we had deployed to Afghanistan around that time. And I forget the precise number. It was well over 10,000, maybe 15,000 or so. And then of that number, I was able to cross-reference various databases and see how many of these folks that were deployed with me had some medical evidence of a contraindication. Either they had a diagnosis in their records saying major depression, anxiety disorder, what have you, or they had a prescription drug record for something like an antidepressant or a benzodiazepine, some anxiety drug. And I forget the number offhand. I think it was something, well, it was probably around 10% of folks that had a contraindication of that kind. And so there we had it in black and white. We had evidence that you couldn't just have a garbage bag full of Mefloquine and hand a box to everyone getting on the plane, because unlike the way the military might have been years earlier, by 2007, after how many years of war, the burden of mental health disorders, neurological disorders had accumulated to the point where this wasn't a rare occurrence anymore. Mm-hmm. It was actually fairly common to have a troop deploying overseas with one or more of these problems. And that would mean Mefloquine, based on our understanding back then, was contraindicated. So that news started getting out around 2008. By this point, I'd come home. And at that point, I realized this is important. This is something that nobody else is looking into. I've seen evidence with my own eyes in Afghanistan that this is a problem, not just breaking these rules that we've talked about, and you know, not speaking necessarily that one fellow's death, but I had seen with my own eyes how this drug had changed people. That in the weeks before I deployed, I knew a few of the guys I deployed with, and early on in their deployment, I noticed how they were, and some of these folks changed pretty significantly.
Yeah.
You know, within at least a few months of the time we got there. There were a lot of angry people. There were a lot of agitated people. There were rumors of people experiencing much more severe problems. So with all the experience I had from being deployed and seeing the drug used in real life, and seeing how differently things were in the field from what folks back within the Beltway, as we call it, you know, at the Pentagon, thought things were with respect to the drugs. I realized I needed to really dig into this. And so that began the career that I'm sure you're familiar with today. I published quite a bit in subsequent years. That certainly didn't endear me to my colleagues and to my bosses. I had given some thought to staying in the military for a full 20 years, you know, retiring, maybe sticking around 30 years, getting a nice big pension. But I knew that I could not continue this work effectively in uniform. I knew that I had to get out and continue my work as a civilian. So my final assignment, they sent me as far away from the flagpole as possible. They sent me to Fort Nowhere, Louisiana, Fort Polk, Louisiana, which was actually a very pleasant place. You know, in a lot of ways, that area is kind of like it is here. You know, there's a lot of refineries and chemical plants and hardworking blue-collar people down there in Lake Charles, where I lived. I really enjoyed my time there. I thought I thrived down there, and that was probably the most productive period of my research career. I published all sorts of stuff when I was down there. And by the time my commitment was up in 2012, by that point I decided, you know what, I'm going to research this topic more formally. So I'd had a house in Baltimore from when I was doing my training up there. I bought a house there, and I kept it throughout all my deployments. So I decided to move back to Baltimore and go back to Hopkins, where I'd got my master's degree. And so I spent the 4 or 5 years there at Hopkins, essentially earning a doctoral degree in this very topic. And I did some additional medical training to earn some other certifications, and published some additional research during that time. But by the time I was done, my training in 2017, I'd like to think I was probably the most qualified person academically to do work in this area and comment on these matters. And I knew at that time we needed to continue this work, not in an academic environment, because there really wasn't the funding for it. You know, the government's not particularly eager to fund research in this area.
Not on us, right?
Not yet. They will,
Yeah.
in due course. But I knew that there wasn't going to be a lot of funding. You know, the military and the VA were not going to say, "Oh, please, Dr. Nevin, take this money and tell us how badly we screwed up." There just wasn't going to be much
Yeah.
interest in that. So I knew that we had to continue our work um, through the equivalent of a private foundation, right? Which is what we established. And of course, around the time I was finishing up my training, my phone started ringing all the time. I was getting calls, seems like every other week, from attorneys who were representing plaintiffs who were alleging the very types of problems that I was studying.
Yep.
And so I realized, I can actually make a living doing medical legal consulting, not just related to Mefloquine for plaintiffs, but also theoretically for defendants, and then also in other areas of medical legal work. So that's how I've been able to support myself and also support some of the research that we've been doing through my private income as a medical legal consultant. And of course, I have some businesses on the side that help pay the bills as well. But when I look back, it really is just remarkable. It's incredible the luck I've been able to experience. Not only being in, I don't want to say the right place, because it certainly wasn't the right place. We can say maybe being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and
For
having
the
this
right reason.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think if the world gives you lemons, you make lemonade, and maybe that was just it. Maybe I was meant to be there and to have this problem land on my lap, and I've just really been fortunate in being able to. I don't want to say single-handedly, because it certainly was. There was so many people that have helped me along the way, but I realize how difficult it is for a doctor or a researcher just independently to make significant progress in an area without institutional support. It's very, very difficult in today's era. And
So are you able to get do you get any grants from the government at all for any of the research?
not yet, not yet. And we have received a small number of funds from various organizations. We can perhaps get into that later. Now, I should actually say, when I was in the military, I did actually receive some funding. I think well over $1 million, if I'm not mistaken, to do some studies of this nature. Now, it ends up they just weren't the right studies, and we didn't uh, conclude those studies with the type of forceful findings that I would have liked. But I think that work probably paved the way for some of my colleagues to do a little bit of similar work in that area. But what the military wasn't willing to commit to were the sorts of studies that would require some type of clinical concession, some type of concession that we have a problem. And what do I mean by this? We've talked about, with limited resources, with limited funding, with a limited amount of time to catch the ear of policymakers. What is the best use of our resources? What is the most important single thing that we could ask for? And I'll tell you what it is. I think what we need policymakers at the VA and Veterans Affairs Canada, and any sort of military related facility, what we need these folks to realize is this problem is not just about veterans who've taken Mefloquine. That actually isn't the population that's of interest here, because, as you know, and I know, and we've all heard this many times, someone will say, "I took Mefloquine and I was just fine. So what's your problem?"
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And it ends up that many people, maybe even a majority, it might be a small minority, but let's just say a majority of people who take Mefloquine, they probably don't have any trouble from it. For them, the drug is neuropsychiatrically inert. For whatever reason, it doesn't even cause nightmares, insomnia, depression, anxiety, restlessness, confusion.
Do
None
you
of that.
think possibly that it's just a matter of time before the side effects start to manifest? Or
Oh, in everyone, right?
yeah, that's
Yeah. So what you're asking is, if you give everyone one tablet of Mefloquine a week,
Yeah.
and you give it to them long enough, will they all inevitably develop some of these prodromal symptoms, the symptoms that the drug
Yes.
company warns are prodromal to a more serious event? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Now, if you want to ensure everyone you give the drug to has those symptoms, you give them a lot more than one tablet. I think the way it seems to me, and unfortunately, we just don't have really good data to substantiate this across all doses and dose rates. But the evidence would suggest that, let's say, a small minority or a large minority will experience these symptoms at a dose rate of one tablet per week. If you double that and you give everyone 2 tablets a week, you're going to see more people experience those prodromal symptoms. It might even now be a majority. If you do the same thing 3 tablets a week, it may be a large majority, not everyone, but a large majority. If you give everyone 4 tablets a week, or 5, or 6, and why you would do that, I don't know. I suppose if you gave everyone 7 tablets a week, which sometimes happens when the drug is misprescribed once a day, if you give everyone 7 tablets a week or 1 tablet a day, almost certainly they're going to experience something. In fact, I'm not familiar with anyone who's been accidentally given 1 tablet a day or 7 tablets a week that doesn't experience some degree of prodromal symptoms. So personal susceptibility, the threshold at which someone will experience prodromal symptoms from mefloquine
Yep.
depends on some most likely innate factors, maybe related to genetics, and it also depends upon the dose rate. And it just so happens that at 1 tablet a week, it's kind of a sweet spot where not everyone experiences it, but enough people do that it should be considered a problem, but it's still low enough that the military can mostly sweep the problem under the rug. And I say sweet spot from the military's perspective, not from the soldier's perspective.
Yeah.
But when you give mefloquine at treatment doses, if you give people 5 or more tablets, I think it's widely recognized that a majority of people will experience those problems. So it's dose rate dependent, and it's also person specific factor dependent.
Yeah.
We think most likely related to genetic factors.
Now, when they started doing the super doses, or when they say to go talk about Guantanamo Bay in 2005, I think they were given the prisoners 750 milligrams. Was it 3 tablets immediately, followed by 12 hours later by another 500 milligrams? And did they not report that in the first week there was 4 or 5 suicides?
Well, Mike, you've opened the manhole to the rabbit hole. So why don't we just go down the rabbit hole right now?
That's what I'm thinking.
So, as you alluded to, and we can get into the details here in a second. I might quibble on some of the facts, but beginning soon after, I believe it was called Camp Delta, soon after Guantanamo Bay was set up.
Yeah,
I think this would have been in early to mid 2002. The military started doing a very interesting thing at Guantanamo Bay. And the justification for this has never really been properly probed and critiqued and examined by my community. And by my community, I'm now referring to the travel medicine, infectious disease, public health community. Because here's what's happened. Here's what happened. Several hundred people ranging from hapless innocents to diehard terrorists were rounded up and put in orange jumpsuits and transported to Guantanamo Bay. And on arrival, notionally for public health purposes, according to standard operating procedure documents that have come to light through various court cases, they were all given treatment doses of mefloquine. Now, ostensibly, the reason for this that has been explained in various places is that, they come from malaria endemic areas like Afghanistan, which isn't particularly endemic, and we wanted to ensure that there was no risk of transmission of malaria to the general population in Cuba. Now, since when have we cared about the general population in Cuba? First of all, that's a little odd. But since when does mefloquine stop transmission? It doesn't. We could go down another rabbit hole of the effects of these drugs and so on. But suffice it to say, the rationale that the military provided for the use of mefloquine in that context makes no medical sense. It's complete nonsense. It's quite silly, actually. And it doesn't match what we do in similar contexts. When we invite refugees to resettle here in the United States, we don't give everyone a big blast of mefloquine on arrival. We would never do that.
Yeah.
When a large number of known malaria-infected Haitian refugees were housed near that very same spot on Guantanamo Bay, I believe a decade earlier, they didn't give everyone treatment doses of mefloquine. Well, they were concerned about malaria. They absolutely were concerned about malaria. But even at the time, they acknowledged that mass use of treatment doses of mefloquine was not the way to deal with the problem.
Yeah.
So why on earth would they give hundreds of terrorist suspects that were being detained at Guantanamo Bay, and as we subsequently learned, were immediately subjected to torture with they were subjected to things, actions and conditions and states that were intended to induce anxiety and confusion and various other mental states that would assist in interrogation, right? This all came out in the wash. So in that context, why would we give hundreds of detainees who immediately upon arrival at Guantanamo, who were about to face weeks of enhanced interrogation, otherwise known as torture, to include situations that would promote anxiety and helplessness and confusion and restlessness, why would we give them mefloquine at treatment doses? Now, perhaps coincidentally, mefloquine at treatment doses is known to cause anxiety, confusion, restlessness, interfere with sleep. It almost seems too good to be true, doesn't it? From the perspective of the interrogators, here's this drug that the medical community thoughtfully administered to protect their health and do good, by the people of Cuba and not risk transmission of malaria. How convenient for the interrogators that this drug that was just administered had synergistic and additive effects to the methods of torture that were being employed.
Yep.
It does seem odd in retrospect, doesn't it? And so I wrote a paper on this, and I said, this is very odd, and it raises the disturbing possibility that this drug was administered not for any anti-malarial purpose. That was just pretext.
Yeah.
The real purpose of administering this drug was to use as an adjunct to interrogation.
Yeah. But now, so later in the war, anyways, for Canada, in order to replace a battlefield casualty, and with mefloquine, you had to preload for a month before. So then, they ended up turning around and giving a mass dose to troops to get them overseas quicker.
Oh, I see. So what you're referring to is called a loading dose.
Yeah.
So let's go over what was known about the recommended use of mefloquine beginning around Somalia time and going forward. So the problem with mefloquine is the fact that it's a very highly lipid-bound substance. Unlike some other antimalarials that can be dosed daily, mefloquine is dosed weekly, and that's partly for ostensible reasons of convenience, but there may be other reasons. The idea behind using mefloquine is that if you take it for enough time, if you've taken it for, let's say, a month or a couple months' time, quite a bit of mefloquine builds up in your system. And it's building up in places where it really doesn't need to be to function as an antimalarial. It's building up in your lungs. It's building up in your liver. There's quite a bit of the drug circulating in your bile. So it's circulating around into your intestines and your gallbladder and so on. Quite a bit of the drug is there. Really all your solid organs, mefloquine's accumulating. And in your adipose tissue and your fat, we think the drug is accumulating. Now, there are some other organs that the drug might accumulate in, one might reasonably think, and one of them is the brain, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, and we'll get to that in a moment. Excuse me. So now the problem with that is that may perfectly be well and good once you've been taking mefloquine for, let's say, a month straight or 2 months straight. You have these reasonably high levels of the drug depoted in various parts of your body, and so it'll sort of ooze out into your blood, and it'll provide antimalarial protection. Even if you stop taking the drug for some time, there'll be enough mefloquine in your blood where it needs to be to work as an antimalarial to function properly. But as even the drug manufacturer concedes, it can take 6, 7, 8 weekly doses for the drug to build up reliably across all people to levels that have effective antimalarial activity, which means that for many people, if they start taking mefloquine, let's say a couple weeks before deployment, they take one 2 weeks before deployment, 1 week before deployment, another one when they get on the plane, many of those folks won't have effective levels of the drug in their system to provide antimalarial protection. It might take another month or more in order for the drug to be at levels that are capable of killing the malaria parasite in the blood. So this is why the drug manufacturer and various militaries have promoted the use of a loading dose. So essentially, if there's a short notice deployment, or if your command was just disorganized, or if they didn't care, they would give people 2 or 3 tablets all at once, or in some dosing schedule more rapid than weekly. Yeah. They would give a large number of tablets over a short period of time with the intent of building up drug levels. But remember what we just talked about a while ago, that folks taking 1 tablet a week for a long period of time might not necessarily develop psychiatric symptoms or prodromal symptoms. But if you give people 2 tablets a week over and over again, the number who will experience neuropsychiatric symptoms is higher. 3 tablets, even higher, and so on and so on. So by giving people a loading dose of mefloquine, you're increasing the probability that people will experience 1 or more of these prodromal symptoms. And we can review them again. Abnormal dreams, nightmares, insomnia, anxiety, depression, restlessness, confusion. Those are symptoms that are specifically listed in various current product inserts as requiring the immediate discontinuation of the drug. But really, the drug manufacturers have said all along that if you experience any psychiatric symptom, it could just be a sense of impending doom, a sense of foreboding, a sense that something is just off, a change in your personality, something really subtle. Any psychiatric symptom that you experience during your use of mefloquine should be considered prodromal, really must be considered prodromal, and an indication to immediately stop the drug. So when a military chooses to use a loading dose, like you've described, what they're essentially doing is increasing the odds that those service members will need to stop taking the drug and switch over to something else. Now, you know as well as I know that no military properly followed those directions. Certainly the Canadian military never, in their use of the drug, acknowledged or operationalized any sort of process to identify soldiers who were experiencing prodromal symptoms and have them immediately discontinue the drug. And we've learned through review of documents from various cases that are currently, in the process of litigation from other jurisdictions, including Ireland, the United Kingdom, and of course here in the United States. We've learned that all militaries, essentially, that have used this drug committed the same critical error, They never acknowledged, they never recognized, or if they did recognize, they didn't operationalize or admit that service members who experience these symptoms must immediately stop taking the drug. And of course, that fundamentally is the problem. And getting back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, what we're interested in exploring further, and what we're interested in the VA and other veterans agencies exploring, is this affected population. Because we're not concerned, and there's no reason to be concerned, about veterans who took mefloquine and never experienced symptoms. They're fine. There's no risk of latent effects as far as we can tell. It's exceedingly unlikely or impossible that someone who took mefloquine who never experienced any problems, who brags about how well they tolerate it and how wonderful a drug it is, there, as far as we can tell, there's no risk that that person is going to develop any sort of psychiatric or neurological problems years from now. Because from all appearances, during their use of the drug wasn't acting as a neurotoxicant. It wasn't entering their brain. Even at very low concentrations in the brain, it would be expected to cause psychiatric symptoms.
Yeah.
So if it wasn't entering the brain, it wasn't causing prodromal symptoms, there would be no reason to think it would have neurotoxic properties. That would sort of be like examining a bunch of people that spent their whole lives with cigarettes in their pocket. Imagine you buy a pack of cigarettes and you just leave it in your pocket and you never smoke the cigarettes. And some people might think, oh, well, you're at risk of lung cancer because you've been exposed to tobacco. Well, no, you haven't, because the cigarettes are still sealed in the container in your pocket. You've never smoked them. So calling that person exposed to tobacco and studying them to see what risk they experience of lung cancer is just sort of silly, because there was no plausible exposure. The smoke has to get in your lungs in order to have a risk of lung cancer. And similarly, studying troops who've taken mefloquine and who've never experienced any psychiatric symptoms or prodromal symptoms during use is somewhat silly. It's naive. It shows that you don't really understand the nature of this problem, because of course there's no risk of neurotoxicity. The drug has to be in the brain and be demonstrating some evidence of physiologic activity in order to have its neurotoxic effects. Instead, what you need to study is that subset of the population who, with our metaphor, takes the cigarettes out of the pack, puts it in their mouth, lights it up, smokes it, and inhales.
Yep.
And the equivalent of that with mefloquine is that subset of the population that's taken mefloquine and experiences prodromal symptoms, experiences acute side effects, experiences the very symptoms: insomnia, abnormal dreams, nightmares, anxiety, depression, restlessness, confusion, that are specifically listed in the product insert as requiring the immediate discontinuation of the drug. An instruction that we know militaries did not follow. And so we're interested in having the VA and other veterans agencies in the military acknowledge this point and identify that subset of veterans who experienced that particular set of circumstances. And I think the best way to do that is simply to ask the question, or some combination of questions. Hey, did you take mefloquine? Yes, I took mefloquine. Okay, all right. That's not necessarily a problem. During your use of mefloquine, did you experience symptoms, psychiatric symptoms, such as abnormal dreams, insomnia, anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion? No, doc, I didn't experience anything like that. Okay, not a problem. But if they say, oh my God, doc, yes, I did. I was at home. We started it 2 weeks before deployment. I developed wicked nightmares right away after the first tablet. They were awful. I don't even want to talk to you about what the nightmares were. They're so disturbing. I thought I was a terrible person. I thought I was going to do terrible things to my family members because I was doing terrible things in these dreams. And then we deployed, and then of course we saw combat, and it was some pretty terrible stuff. But at night, my nightmares were of me doing terrible things to my family members, not of the combat. And if we ask them, I say, okay, look, you've been diagnosed with PTSD. You told your psychiatrist you're experiencing nightmares. You came home from deployment, during which time you used mefloquine. When you came home from deployment, you were anxious, you were depressed, you were having trouble sleeping, you had nightmares. You didn't tell your psychiatrist what your nightmares were about, but you said you were having nightmares. And your doctor immediately labeled you with PTSD. Is that right? What happened? They'll say, yes, doc, that's what happened. I said, can I ask you a question? What would you rather do? Would you rather relive the traumatic experiences in real life that your PTSD has been attributed to by your psychiatrists? Or would you rather have the nightmares of you doing terrible things to your family members? Which situation would you rather experience? Many Mefloquine veterans will say, Doc, I will take combat any day of the week and twice on Sunday because they're in control of the situation. It's something real. And their nightmares, which often don't have anything to do with combat, but they don't talk about this, are much worse. They're much more horrific. They're terrible. They're ego dystonic. It gets to the core of their very being. They think they're evil, terrible people. It's more frightening, the type of nightmares you can experience on this drug. So simply asking the questions, did you take Mefloquine and did you experience symptoms during your use of Mefloquine? This can prompt the examiner or the psychiatrist, hopefully, to ask more detailed probing questions about the history of the symptoms that might have contributed to other diagnoses that could confound or complicate or confuse the recognition of Mefloquine-associated problems. So this is what our efforts are focused on, the need to screen veterans for a history of symptomatic Mefloquine exposure, which is the real risk factor, which hasn't yet been properly studied.
Yeah. And would you say, because you wrote or you had an article in a paper, I think in 2015, that was talking about, at the time there was 400,000 people a year taking Mefloquine or being prescribed Mefloquine at the time, and then you talked about a few incidents. I think you talked about the Green Beret that was charged with cowardice, and then he beat that with because he was suffering psychosis or something.
Oh, right, yeah, and I can share the details of this case because the individual involved has freely consented to having these facts shared. This case is well known. It's been described in numerous media pieces, including 60 Minutes, I believe, and in GQ magazine of all places.
Sure.
I think you're referring to the case of Sergeant Andrew Pagani.
Yes, I believe that's
Yeah. Okay. And his case is illustrative, so we can review his case, and this would be helpful in demonstrating the differences between a purely psychiatric combat-related disorder and a confounding Mefloquine-related disorder. So Pagani was in perfect health prior to his Iraq deployment. I think this was in 2003 or 2004, right at the start of the war, right? And he had a top secret clearance. I think he was seconded or assigned to a special forces unit. Not exactly sure what his specialty was, but anyway, the team had landed in Iraq, and they were making their way to the team house where they were going to base their operations out of. And just coincidentally, as often happens in a combat zone, the convoy they were in happened to pass a dead body. Now, I don't want to dismiss the potential trauma that might induce, but we all know dead bodies are a dime a dozen in combat zones, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing, and they're not usually clean. They're usually mangled up pretty good, right? I mean, that's dead body. I've seen plenty of dead bodies. I used to pronounce people dead when I was overseas on deployment. We've all seen lots of dead bodies, and it's not pleasant. But the significance of Pagani seeing this mangled, dead corpse, I think, was grossly overemphasized in the initial interpretation of events that followed. So Andrew gets to his team house, and I think by this point he's feeling a little anxious, and he's feeling a little off. He's feeling maybe a little paranoid at this point. Now, of course, like everyone else in his team, he'd been taking Mefloquine. So I think by this point he'd had 2 or 3 tablets. I write about it in my case report, but I think if my recollection is correct, he'd had a couple tablets and hadn't really experienced any symptoms up until that point. So the onset of his symptoms, almost certainly from Mefloquine, coincided with his arrival and coincided with his seeing all sorts of wartime things, such as dead bodies, which we know are not uncommon. And so he was able to get to bed that night. And in the middle of the night, he was awoken by what he thought was an attack on his team house. Explosions, fireballs, incoming rounds. He was terrified. And so naturally, being a good soldier, he donned his combat gear. I think he grabbed his rifle and he proceeded to do a search of his team house. He wanted to check on his buddies. And when he opened the room where his other buddies were sleeping, what he saw terrified him, because instead of seeing his buddies just sleeping comfortably there, they looked exactly like the mangled, dead corpse that he had seen the day before. Now, without awareness that he was taking mefloquine, a psychiatrist might say, "Oh, well, this is an acute stress reaction. He was suffering from early post-traumatic stress, acute stress disorder, from seeing this dead body, and he was hallucinating things, purely as a psychiatric response to stress." That would be what psychiatrists would tell you.
Yeah.
Now, if you're familiar with the known effects of mefloquine, which can affect people who take the drug while they're sipping Mai Tais on the beach, you would know that those symptoms he's experiencing are much more likely to represent simple adverse reactions to mefloquine. He was experiencing a complex visual illusion, not just a hallucination. He was misperceiving things. So his eyes were seeing his buddies sleeping comfortably in their beds because the team house was not actually under attack. This was all in Pagani's head. It was a nightmare. But instead of seeing them as they actually were, he was misperceiving them. He was in the throes of an acute psychotic state. So he was essentially hallucinating them being different from what they were. It's a complex visual illusion. So at this point, he knew something was wrong, right? This didn't make any sense to him, right? That he was still under attack. He was surrounded by flames and fireballs and explosions. But perhaps by this point, he realized he was going nuts. This was not actually happening, right? So the next day, still in this state and feeling very uncertain about himself because, of course, he's in the midst of acute psychosis. But unlike most psychosis, he was aware. He had insight into the fact that all was not well. And this is very different than many people with psychosis who think they're Jesus or who think that, the light bulb is talking to them. He was aware that, well, the light bulb may be talking to him, but he knew that wasn't right. So he had awareness, and preserved insight and awareness is unusual for this sort of situation, not due to mefloquine. So he went to his team leader, and even though his team leader to him looked just like the mangled corpse that he saw a day prior, this mangled talking corpse was talking to him saying, "Pagani, get a grip on yourself. Stop being a," can I swear on this?
Yes, you can swear.
"Stop being a pussy and get a grip on yourself. You're fine. You look fine. Stop complaining." Right. And I'm somewhat ad-libbing here. I don't know exactly what was said, but words to that effect were said. And so they told him to get back to work, right? Nobody recognized that he was suffering acute effects from mefloquine poisoning. Nobody thought, "Oh, well, wait a second. This drug we were all given, the label says some people might experience psychosis and hallucinations, right? Loss of touch with reality." Nobody recognized this as a common side effect of this medication. Instead, they said, "Look, if you don't get your act together, we're going to charge you with cowardice. We're going to throw you in jail, and we're going to seek the death penalty." That's basically what his command told him. Right. So, what's this poor man supposed to do? He just needs help. He knows he's going crazy. Right. Now, of course, the psychiatrist, as they're apt to do, took pity on him and assumed that he must be suffering some sort of acute stress reaction or PTSD. Hence the reason why this dead, mangled corpse that he'd seen previously was elevated so much in importance, because there had to be something that explains this, something psychiatric that explains this. But, even if he hadn't seen the corpse, if he was dreaming, I don't know, if he was thinking of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, let's say, in the hours before this psychosis hit, then he would have likely perceived all of his teammates as mangled, bloodthirsty Stay Puft Marshmallow Men. Right? I mean, just like in Ghostbusters, whatever's in your mind will take on horrific proportions and characteristics. And so whatever was front of his mind, in this case, an incidental dead body at the side of the road. Again, as terrible as it is, not really that big of a deal in combat. We all know. This was elevated to a position of significance and filled his hallucinations. But it could have been anything. It could have been the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. It could have been just a generic demon or a monster figure, which is quite common. It could have been some sort of generic evil animal like a snake, or maybe an alligator or a dragon or something like that. It could have been anything. In which case, if it were those things, the psychiatrists would probably be scratching their heads and wondering, why is this man hallucinating or dreaming of horrific Stay Puft Marshmallow, right? But in this particular case, it was easy because the psychiatrists were looking for PTSD. They were all trained in PTSD. They were more than eager and willing to blame all of this on acute stress, on a perceived traumatic event. So he came home, and I believe they were thinking he had a really bad case of PTSD. But incidentally, he was also dizzy. He developed a significant amount of dizziness, vertigo, a sense of motion, sense of instability on his feet. He was just a little off in his head. And eventually he made his way to a specialist who was able to identify evidence on examination of brainstem dysfunction. The type of dizziness and vertigo and disequilibrium that he had wasn't a problem in his inner ears, where some of our balance sense organs reside, or with the nerves that connected to the brainstem. He was found to have a constellation of findings that were best localized to the brainstem. So he had a central or brainstem vestibulopathy, or vestibular disorder. And by this time, there was growing awareness of this problem in the military, that a number of people were coming home with psychiatric symptoms with brainstem evidence of vestibulopathy. And so his attorney was able to say, look, this is not just a bad traumatic reaction to seeing a dead body. This man has objective evidence of brain injury. Now, we can argue what term is best used in this context. I would describe these findings as signs and symptoms of encephalopathy. Brain injury, technically, yes, that's true. But brain injury, I don't think is particularly helpful in this context because people think of traumatic brain injury. And so I prefer to use the term encephalopathy, toxic encephalopathy, or toxic brain dysfunction, which is exactly what he had. And that can be associated with a risk of permanent neurotoxicity, neuronal injury, actual cell level death, due to the encephalopathic effects. But it's all encephalopathy. Whether cells die or not, it's still a form of chronic encephalopathy in this case. And that's what his lawyers essentially argued he had. He had brain injury, or what I would call encephalopathy or quineism, due to mefloquine. And so the military was able to recognize, they goofed. They took this guy who was experiencing a horrific reaction to a drug they ordered him to take. And not only did they miss the fact that he was having this reaction, but they got it completely wrong. They called him a coward. They threatened him with death on prosecution. And all he needed was someone to recognize he was suffering these side effects. So I think they dropped the charges. I think they dropped all the charges, gave him an honorable discharge. And his permanent record shows that he had a reaction to mefloquine of some kind. And so he's receiving disability benefits that were specifically attributed to the effects of mefloquine. So he was one of the earlier cases, right? This was back in 2003, but he's certainly not the only one. There were cases similarly recognized in the years prior, and there have been many, many, many cases recognized in subsequent years.
And then, so even for that, is it Staff Sergeant Baines? Was he?
Oh, Bales.
Oh, Bales, sorry.
Sergeant Bales.
Yeah.
Do we want to go down that rabbit hole as well?
So, I mean, that one, that was part of their defense, was it not?
Actually, it wasn't. It wasn't. So you're referring to Staff Sergeant Robert Bales. Robert Bales joined the military on 9/11. If I'm not mistaken, and for those listening who recognize that name, there are a number of podcasts. There have been a few podcasts. One recently specifically on Robert Bales, multi-part podcast. Encourage you to listen to these podcasts and learn more about this case because it really is instructive. So Robert Bales signed up on 9/11, good patriot, signed up on 9/11, deployed numerous times. I think he was in Iraq in or around 2003, around the same time as Pagani and many other veterans who your listeners will know of. And of course, the medical records are typically terrible from that era. Many folks were prescribed Mefloquine either in formation or they were just given a box, and there's no record of it in their medical records at all. Of course, the same way Vietnam era veterans, they don't have a page in their medical record saying this service member was exposed to copious amounts of Agent Orange sprayed on them and on their, equipment. And so it's not in their medical records. It doesn't mean it never happened.
Yep.
Right. But in Bales' case, we do have evidence he actually took Mefloquine. There's at least one member of his unit that has attested that the drug was given under conditions of directly observed therapy, meaning everyone was in formation. Bales was in formation with this witness. Everyone was given Mefloquine. Did this guy see Bales open his mouth and take the pill? I don't think so, but can it be reasonably concluded that Bales took at least one dose of Mefloquine at least one of these mandatory formations in and around 2003? Absolutely. I don't think there's any doubt that Bales took Mefloquine throughout that deployment. And I think as more evidence is gathered, many more members of his unit will attest to this, and it might be possible to establish that Mefloquine is issued to this unit, etc. So let's just put aside the question of whether he took Mefloquine. As we've been emphasizing, just taking Mefloquine doesn't matter. It's a necessary precondition, but taking Mefloquine alone is inconsequential unless you experience prodromal symptoms, right?
Yep.
Now, Bales is a tough nut. He's a very stoic guy. Bales, who incidentally I think is probably covering for the second person who took part in events of that day. I'm increasingly convinced Bales is covering for someone else, but that's another story. He's a very stoic guy, and he's not quick to admit weakness or problems. And he's the sort of guy who will take secrets to his death. He's just as funny as this will sound, he's a very honorable guy that way. Yeah. But regardless, he probably won't admit to feeling weak or experiencing weak-seeming psychiatric symptoms during that initial deployment. He's very much a suck it up and drive on kind of guy. But he did incidentally admit to me he did hallucinate on at least one occasion. He saw purple people running across one particular bridge, and that is not normal. No matter how little sleep you have, the type of hallucination he described is not really consistent with any condition other than Mefloquine intoxication. So I believe it's very likely, or let's just say it's likely for the purposes of this, that he took Mefloquine and experienced prodromal symptoms during his Iraq deployment. Now, there's more circumstantial evidence that he suffered from these problems during his Iraq deployment. He came back from that deployment, and he was a changed guy. His wife describes him basically getting up in the middle of the night and running patrol around the house looking for the bad guys, right? This is not normal. Now, at the time, she thought, he's just being a good husband. But in retrospect, this is not normal. This man is paranoid, right? He's suffering from paranoid persecutory delusions that the bad guys are after him, right? I mean, if my doors are locked and I have a gun at my bedside and I hear something outside and I don't strongly suspect that something bad, especially if I'm living in a safe neighborhood and I have no reason to think there's prowlers or something outside, I'm just going to lay there for a while and not go out in full combat gear and do a perimeter check of my house. I'm just going to lay there and let circumstances evolve and see if action is necessary at some later time. I'm not going to do what he did, right? That demonstrates a very heightened level of paranoia, right? Or anxiety, right? Yep. Okay, so he was he experienced symptoms. He took Mefloquine. He experienced symptoms during his Iraq deployment, and he came back a changed guy, right? But because he was very stoic and he hid his feelings, and he wanted to be a good sergeant, he kept a lot of this. He didn't really complain, right? And he also wanted to be a sniper and so on. So the last thing you want to be saying if you want to go to sniper school is, "Oh yeah, doc, I'm all messed up in the head." Right,
Yeah,
exactly. You're not going to say those things. So regardless, he deployed several other times, and did experience some other problems. He definitely hit his head a few times. He was definitely suffering from headaches in the aftermath of that. But I think the onset of his fundamental problem, the paranoid persecutory delusions, the loss of touch with reality, I think that was set off during his initial use of mefloquine in Iraq. So then then he gets deployed to Afghanistan a final time in 2012, I believe.
Yeah.
And if my facts are correct, late 2011 or early 2012, he gets there. Do we know for certain he was on mefloquine? No, we don't. There's only circumstantial evidence. There is evidence he was prescribed a bottle of doxycycline as he was leaving, I believe, Fort Lewis, whatever it's called today. Maybe it's still called Fort Lewis. Army can't leave well enough alone. But as he was leaving Fort Lewis, he was definitely prescribed a bottle of doxycycline. But we know from the inventory of drugs that were found in his possession at the time of his arrest that a full bottle of doxycycline was found. Now, what's interesting is that drug doesn't appear to have been dispensed at Fort Lewis. Those records that I've reviewed shows that prescription was never filled. So where did he get the doxycycline? Well, he went through Kandahar, apparently, and there's some suggestion that maybe he got some drugs there. And we can't rule out the possibility that maybe he got doxycycline there. Maybe he also got mefloquine. Maybe he only got mefloquine there. We don't know for certain. But we do know that there were a number of drug bottles that were found and inventoried at the time of his arrest that for whatever reason the Army didn't bother to characterize. Now, I find that very interesting, right? The Army has unlimited resources. They threw the book at this guy and they spared no expense, even flying a bunch of Afghans
I read
on
that.
civilian airlines and taking them to SeaWorld. So
and interpreters in order
everyone,
to
they spent millions on this case. So there was no shortage of resources. And yet there were a number of medication bottles found in his possession at the time of his arrest, which were inventoried, that the military states, essentially, we didn't have time to characterize this drug. We didn't bother testing it. They don't even describe what's written on the label, Mike. I mean, this could have been a bottle labeled mefloquine made out to Robert Bales with, 4 of 7 tablets still in the bottle. 3 haven't been taken, for all we know.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the report doesn't mention any characteristics of this bottle to rule that possibility out. So the possibility that he was taking mefloquine at this time hasn't been ruled out. Now, there are some factors that would suggest he should have been on an antimalarial. He was in Kandahar. And Kandahar, that river valley, is the most malaria endemic area of Afghanistan. That's really where the malaria problem comes from. And it's not just Vivax malaria, it's falciparum malaria. It's the kind of malaria that will kill you quick, like that.
Right.
And this was a special forces unit far from definitive medical care on occasion, right? They might have been isolated there for at least a few hours if things got bad. So they couldn't risk someone developing sudden onset fever from malaria there. I would think by this time there would have been some sort of mandatory order from SOCOM or whatever saying, all right, guys, unlike the 82nd that started their pills in January, you guys at least got to start it by now. Like it's March, get on it. Start enforcing anti-malarial discipline. And the SF guys will tell you these people took anti-malarials all the time. They took mefloquine all the time. The Green Berets, right? The Deltas, they were taking mefloquine all the time. So why wouldn't they be taking mefloquine there in Kandahar, where there's a risk of malaria around that time of year just starting? Why wouldn't they? They should be taking some anti-malarial. Now, we know he wasn't taking his doxycycline. Why? Because the bottle was sealed and all the tablets were in there. So he wasn't taking doxycycline. What anti-malarial was he taking? So the question is still open. Now, even if we can show that he wasn't taking mefloquine during this deployment, I would argue that he was still nonetheless laboring under the chronic effects of his earlier exposure. The man was paranoid. The man had magical thinking. You'll recall this story about this tree that he obsessed over in the days before the events in question. He assigned this tree, which he thought was some sort of spotter's mark used to set off an IED in the days before these incidents. He assigned this tree supernatural qualities, and he took it upon himself to spend basically the whole day hacking away at this tree. What normal person does this? So, someone who believes that this tree has magical significance or unusual significance beyond what most people would assign it is motivated to do something seemingly nuts like that. This is, in my mind, this is evidence that he was laboring under not only persecutory delusions, but magical thinking, tendency to connect dots that aren't there, right?
Okay.
So now it comes to the night in question, right? The Army in its official report will tell you that the psychiatrists looked over his case and found no evidence of psychosis, no evidence of hallucinations, no evidence of abnormal thought processes. And that better be the case, because if he did show any evidence of hallucinations, abnormal thought processes, paranoia, or delusions, then he might be considered not to be mentally sound for trial. The Army has a very low bar for a finding of insanity. So, of course, since he was found guilty, or he accepted a plea bargain, he couldn't have been mentally unstable, according to the Army. So, of course, the report doesn't find that. However, the findings of the psychiatric report are demonstrably false. They're demonstrably false because they're directly contradicted by other testimony of record in the case. So what is conceded by both parties in this case? The government concedes this, that Bales was on lookout the night before. He had guard duty, and he was up in a guard tower with another soldier, and they were out looking at the bleak Afghan terrain, and he could see both villages in question that he later attacked. And the record of trial emphasizes this. It's right there in the record of trial. He reported seeing flashing lights being exchanged between the two villages. And he even pointed out to his buddy who was guarding along with him, hey, do you see those flashing lights? And the other fellow apparently said, no, there's no flashing lights. I'm sure he said, you're crazy, there's no flashing lights. But Bales insisted there were flashing lights on numerous occasions. Apparently, he made reference to these flashing lights that very clearly weren't there because the other fellow didn't see them. And just think about this. So Bales is thinking, all right, what is going on here? These villagers are exchanging messages through flashing lights. Later that evening, he spins this tale as he's drinking, as soldiers are apt to do. There's nothing unusual about that. So he's sitting drinking. And for anyone that thinks he drank a lot, you probably need to hang out with more soldiers because he really didn't drink all that much, all things considered. And the critical observation in question preceded his drinking. The fact that he saw these flashing lights, which were not there
prior to drinking,
when he was supposedly of sound mind. He saw these flashing lights, and he's weaving this tale to explain it, right? He had been increasingly upset that his village was coming under, that his outpost was coming under attack by these Taliban who were hiding among the civilian population, planting IEDs, without being caught. And so he was primed to see danger in his environment. And the explanation he conjured was that these flashing lights were the Taliban who were hiding amongst the civilians in these villages, plotting the details of an imminent attack. If not that very night, sometime very soon. And Bales was so upset that his buddies couldn't see what he saw clearly. These people were very clearly conspiring under their noses to attack them. The attack was imminent. We need to do something or else we're going to get killed. This is what was going on in Bales' mind, right? And nobody could see what he saw. So what did he do? Now, we don't know exactly what happened. I'm increasingly suspecting he managed to convince someone else that they needed to act. He may have been charismatic enough, and this crazy tale of his might have been just convincing enough that he convinced one of his buddies there to come out with him that first time. But regardless, Bales was being motivated by this deluded notion that these villagers had been communicating with flashing lights, plotting an imminent attack. And Bales decided he needed to do something about that.
Yeah.
That makes no sense. That's crazy. Who communicates with flashing lights? They all had cell phones back then. They could have just ridden their motorcycle over and said, hey, Habib, let's attack tonight. Okay, let's do it. Let's do it at 2 a.m. There's no reason to exchange messages with flashing lights. Who thinks of something like this? Someone who is crazy, who is psychotic, who has crazy, deluded, persecutory ideas in their mind from, most likely, their prior use or potentially current use of mefloquine. That's the theory that his current defense team has been trying to advance.
Yep.
But the military refuses to acknowledge that he ever took mefloquine. And so this theory can't be further explored. And of course, during his trial, this never came up. The question of mefloquine never came up properly during his first trial. So this question has never actually been properly litigated.
Because they don't want to go there, because that's...
Well, the U.S. military doesn't want to risk being itself held responsible for the greatest war atrocity in recent memory. In the same way that the military didn't want to publicly admit the wrong that it committed to Andrew Pagani, it doesn't want to admit the possibility that Bales might actually be somewhat of a victim in this circumstance, that he was essentially poisoned and driven to madness, and that this series of events that took place was actually some odd, deluded attempt by Bales to save his outpost.
Yep.
As awful as that was.
Now, did you say you spoke with him?
I've spoken to Bales.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe on at least 2 occasions.
Where is he in Leavenworth?
He's in Leavenworth right now. Yeah, and his family has relocated there to be closer to him. At this point, they're just hoping that he'll be able to get out of jail at some point and live some number of years outside of jail, whether in a permanent psychiatric facility or perhaps less likely at home. That is yet to be determined. But his attorneys who are working with him on these appeals and I have been working together on this. But the major problem has been that all of the various levels of appeal have refused to accept the possibility that he could have been given mefloquine. And the primary argument for this refusal has been, well, it's not in his medical records.
Yeah.
Well, there, in many cases, a majority of folks who deployed overseas don't have any evidence of antimalarials in their medical records. That's not dispositive. That's not probative evidence. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as they say. And in this particular case, I don't want to be critical to the courts involved. I think they made an honest mistake. They don't realize that practices differ very, very much from what they might expect in the field. I'm wondering if the members of the court have actually deployed, because had they deployed, they would know that very often you get handed a bunch of pills or a bunch of stuff happens to you in the field and it's never documented in your medical records.
Here's your garbage bag.
Here's your garbage bag. Grab a box.
On.
Right, exactly. So I had a box of pills that was prescribed to some other person, right? So that just throws the dispositive nature or the probative nature of prescription records in deployed settings out the window, doesn't it? Because you can't trust it. There has to be some sort of corroboration, and you have to take the veteran's word, or you have to take independent accounts of what happened into consideration. And the courts have just refused to do that in Bales' case. But I think most reasonable veterans, I think most reasonable people would concede that Bales took mefloquine in Iraq. He came back a changed guy. And just like so many veterans who've only deployed once, right? Like many Somali veterans, they take mefloquine for a few weeks overseas, for a few months overseas, like Bales did. They come back permanently changed. And they might experience psychotic events. They might experience permanent paranoia and delusions decades into the future, right? So how unusual is it that Bales might have experienced the same thing. It's not unusual at all. It's not unexpected at all.
Has there been many case studies documenting, say, the percentage of people that might have, experienced psychosis, or, do we have any stats on?
Well, we don't, but we can make some reasonable inferences in that regard. First of all, I think we need to acknowledge that psychosis in military settings is grossly underreported, right? It doesn't do a soldier any good, as we learned in Pagani's case, to go up to their sergeant or their commander and say, hey, boss, by the way, I'm seeing things. You look like a talking mangled corpse to me. I need help. That's a one-way ticket to the brig, basically, or to a discharge. So soldiers are not incentivized to report symptoms of psychosis, and in many cases, they'll be so terrified of what's going on that seeking medical attention in some cases might not even be front of their mind. Right? They'll try anything, including alcohol in copious amounts, to deal with that, rather than admit to someone what's going on. Right? So I don't think we can trust that psychosis is not actually much more common. Now, what soldiers will report are things like insomnia, nightmares, in studies where the investigators are specifically saying, all right, look, we need to know what sort of symptoms you're experiencing. So feel free to tell us. Things like insomnia and nightmares, if they don't describe the actual content, it might be more likely to be reported. So what we know from a combination of studies and some civilian studies is that if you were to give Mefloquine to, let's say, 100 people, and you were to basically order them to keep taking it, you weren't checking them for prodromal symptoms. You would just say, all right, every week take your pill, right? Oh, you're having side effects? Too bad. Suck it up, soldier, drive on, right? Conditions of mandatory administration over a number of weeks to months.
Yep.
I'm confident that we're going to see at least single-digit percentages of that 100. So somewhere between 1 and 10, let's say, as a first estimate, of folks emerging from that experience with some degree of permanent neuropsychiatric disability, whether that's simply permanent insomnia, sleep disturbances, permanent nightmare disorder, some degree of permanent anxiety or depression, perhaps permanent personality changes, more paranoia, more irritation, more aggression, some permanent change in their mood or behavior or personality, I think, will be seen in roughly 1 to 10 or 1 to 10% of people. Yeah. It's certainly, it's not trivial. It's not a trivial percentage. Now, this number is inclusive of all the folks that don't experience any symptoms, right? So in 100 people who take the drug every week, I'm confident you're going to see 1 or 2 handfuls, somewhere in that order, of people who are permanently disabled. But keep in mind, not all of those 100 people experienced any symptoms during use of the drug. What percentage experienced symptoms? Let's just say a large minority, maybe 30%, 40%, maybe in some cases up to 50%. And those are the people who are at risk. So the actual percentage of people who take Mefloquine experience symptomatic exposure, experience symptoms that indicate a personal susceptibility to more permanent or chronic effects, that number who go on to develop some degree of disability might be double or more that figure I just cited. Could it be 20%? Could it be 30%? I think those are reasonable estimates.
Yep.
We need to do larger studies. And of course, if we were to screen all veterans for symptomatic exposure history, if we were to ask 1 million veterans who've taken Mefloquine, hey, did you experience symptoms during use? Yeah, okay, 50% say, yeah, I did definitely experience symptoms during use. I can reliably attribute it to the drug. And then we were to look at what percentage of those experienced chronic effects after developing prodromal symptoms. I wouldn't be surprised if it's on the order of 10%, 20%, 30%. That wouldn't surprise me at all. But we have to do the studies to know for certain. So right now, all we have are some reasonable estimates or approximations.
And how could you go about getting the study, or could you do that through a survey, through surveys?
Right. So it
or-
would be done essentially automatically. So if we were to operationalize the routine screening of veterans for this history, this critical history of symptomatic mefloquine exposure, if in the VA system it were to be part of the regular screening questions that are asked all the time, and veterans, they have to run this gauntlet of survey questions when they go for care at the VA, right? You know, were you subject to military sexual trauma? Did you sleep near burn pits? You know, do you have stable housing? They ask every question of veterans except
Did you take?
did you take mefloquine? And during your use of mefloquine, did you experience symptoms? So they could add these survey questions in the US and the UK and Ireland and Canada. They could get this data point on every veteran, every post Somalia, every post 9/11 veteran, excuse me, every Somalia post 9/11 veteran. They could get this answer. So we could figure out what percentage experienced symptoms, how many experienced symptoms. And then at that point, it would require a more detailed review. A psychiatrist or someone with experience in the field would need to go through their record and ask them, okay, all right, let's talk more about these symptoms. You say you have nightmares. When did the nightmares start? You have post-traumatic stress disorder. So presumably the nightmares started after your trauma.
Yeah.
Oh, no, doc, actually, that's not true. No, we didn't get shot at until 6 months into the deployment. Up until then, we were just sitting eating crab legs and ice cream at the chow hall every night. And it was only 6 months in that some crazy guy came on base and started shooting us up. And that's why everyone thinks I have PTSD. And the psychiatrist might say, well, wait a second, but it says here you have PTSD, and we've attributed it to that event, but you're telling me you've had nightmares even from before deployment? Yeah. How does that make any sense? It's not pre-traumatic stress disorder. It's post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
So how in this particular case, how would we explain the nightmares beforehand? Well, if the psychiatrist is aware of the effects of mefloquine, the psychiatrist might say, well, wait a second. When did you start taking mefloquine? Oh, 3 weeks before deployment. You developed nightmares the following week. What are the nightmares of? Were the nightmares of this terrible incident when the gunman came on base and started shooting people? No, doc. The nightmares were of monsters, demons attacking me and my family, and I was unable to help. And I'm a terrible person because this monster is going after me and attacking my family because the monster thinks I'm evil. You know, and so if the veteran simply reports their history and the psychiatrist listens, then we might be able to actually disentangle who has true PTSD from an actual traumatic event, and who is just suffering from the predictable known nightmares from mefloquine, which can, as we know, become permanent. But without asking the questions, without being curious, military psychiatrists and psychiatrists who see veterans are very apt to just attribute any nightmare that develops around the time of deployment to some presumed traumatic event.
Yeah.
Post-traumatic stress disorder was once not a thing, right? In the 1960s and 1970s during Vietnam and in its aftermath, there was no diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. It was only formalized in 1980. And so prior to that, a veteran would come home, experience awful nightmares from combat, and tell their psychiatrist, something's wrong with me. You know, I can't leave the war behind. And the psychiatrist would say, well, you know, you're just crazy. There's nothing like this in the textbooks of psychiatry. You know, just I don't know, go fish and get over it, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't have any diagnosis that we know anything of. And then in 1980, that all changed. They recognized post-traumatic stress disorder. And at first, it was a little difficult to get a diagnosis. But before long, everyone was getting a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. You get a hangnail overseas, and you'll get diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. The doctors throw the diagnosis at people on the basis of them having certain symptoms without looking into the actual history of trauma and whether the trauma is significant enough and whether the symptoms actually follow the trauma. There's very little real world adherence to the formal diagnostic criteria. And of course, one of the new diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder is that the symptoms can't be due to the effects of a medical condition or the effects of a substance. So if your nightmares and your anxiety and depression and insomnia are due to a medical condition, such as a toxic encephalopathy caused by mefloquine, you actually can't be diagnosed formally with post-traumatic stress disorder. So, a long about way of answering your question, if we ever do identify veterans with this symptomatic exposure, this will result in a reassessment of their psychiatric histories. And at that point, perhaps the psychiatry community, the military community will recognize that a certain subset of the PTSD, TBI population actually doesn't have either of those conditions, that the symptoms are much more logically attributed to mefloquine. And only once this happens, only after the psychiatry community recognizes this possibility and does the appropriate clinical studies, will we get a firm answer. But I'm telling you, Mike, this number will not be insignificant. It's not going to be a small, trivial fraction. It will be a significant fraction of Somalia and post 9/11 era veterans who will be found to be suffering to some extent from mefloquine poisoning.
Yep.
And we can get into some weeds here. It really is fascinating. Even the notion of post-traumatic stress disorder, I think, is going to need to be reexamined. Because when did post-traumatic stress disorder as a condition come to our attention?
Like a decade before mefloquine. Is that
Well, as I was alluding to, it was in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, wasn't it?
which anti-malarias were used then?
Aha. Okay.
And did one of those anti-malarias have the same ingredients of mefloquine?
That's right. So just as a refresher, in World War I and World War II, during the Korean War, there was no consideration given to the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people would come home with what was termed shell shock, and some other people would have gross stress reactions. But there really wasn't widespread acknowledgement of the possibility of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, in Vietnam, a number of veterans came home and quickly started advocating to the psychiatry community in the VA that something funny was going on with them. And in fact, these Vietnam veterans were describing what the medical community originally referred to as Vietnam syndrome. They hadn't yet come up with post-traumatic stress disorder as a name. They called it Vietnam syndrome. And if you look at the original literature describing Vietnam syndrome, it was a much more neurologic disorder. It was a combination of psychiatric and neurological symptoms. And this is what the veterans were advocating be investigated. This combination of symptoms like dizziness, vertigo, hearing problems, tinnitus, and various psychiatric disorders and symptoms, including things like paranoia. So when the psychiatry community in the VA finally decided to acknowledge something, the disorder that emerged, post-traumatic stress disorder, was actually quite different than Vietnam syndrome, but it was good enough to meet the needs of these veterans. And so it's just become established. Now, do I doubt that there is something called post-traumatic stress disorder? No, I don't doubt it at all. But what I think is important to emphasize is that the condition that originally led to post-traumatic stress disorder being recognized as a diagnosis is much more similar to what we recognize as mefloquine poisoning today than to post-traumatic stress disorder alone. So how might this have happened? Well, it ends up that in Vietnam, we weren't using mefloquine because mefloquine hadn't been developed, but we were using a combination of drugs. We were using chloroquine and primaquine together or in isolation. And each of these drugs, to some extent, chloroquine much more, can cause the very same symptoms as mefloquine. Chloroquine, mefloquine, primaquine, as the names suggest, they're all quinoline drugs. They all share a common core, and they all have similar toxicological properties. They all have the same ability to penetrate into the brain and theoretically act on certain targets and induce neurotoxicity. But if we go back further in time, if we go back to World War I and we go back to World War II, we can actually see evidence of similar problems. Maybe not at the same scale, but we can see evidence of similar problems. Quinine, the prototypical quinoline antimalarial, the naturally occurring extract of the cinchona tree. Quinine can cause similar problems. And it was widely used in certain theaters in World War I. And not unsurprisingly, there were lots of reports of psychiatric problems in units given quinine during World War I. In World War II, whether you were given antimalarials depended very much on where you were. So if you were purely in the European theater, not in Italy or Sicily, you weren't getting antimalarials. But if you were in the South Pacific or you were in North Africa and then invading Italy through Sicily, you were getting antimalarials. You were getting a drug called Adabrin or quinacrine, which is chemically very similar to chloroquine. It just has an extra ring. So these are all very similar drugs. Quinine in World War I, quinacrine, which is similar to chloroquine in World War II, chloroquine and primaquine in Korea and Vietnam, and then, of course, mefloquine from the late 80s forward. In World War II, if you go back and look at the literature, there's ample evidence of epidemics of psychotic-like anxious behavior among troops given Adabrin. And in fact, early reports from the first major land battle in the South Pacific, the Battle of Guadalcanal, describe epidemics of severe psychiatric illness, which the psychiatry community attributed to the horrific warlike conditions. The ferocity of battle were leaving people permanently scarred with this severe psychosis. But in retrospect, what these psychiatrists were describing was probably simply Adabrin psychosis. And so I think we have evidence going back a century of the role of mefloquine or related quinoline compounds contributing to psychiatric disability among veterans, which we have been apt to retrospectively attribute to post-traumatic stress. And so what does all of this mean? What it means is when we finally acknowledge the potential role of mefloquine and related quinoline drugs in psychiatric conditions among veterans, we are going to have to throw away the entirety of our accumulated research on PTSD. Why? Because we're going to realize it's all invalid, because we won't be certain that the patients developing symptoms that were attributed to post-traumatic stress, or we won't be able to be certain, with limited exceptions, that they weren't actually suffering simply from Adabrin psychosis or chloroquine psychosis or mefloquine psychosis or chloroquine-induced anxiety or chloroquine-induced insomnia or mefloquine-induced insomnia. The entire body of literature is going to be subject to questioning and re-examination. And so you can imagine why the psychiatry community is not particularly excited or enthused about acknowledging this, because many people have made their careers talking about military PTSD,
DPM or whatever, all the
they've based their career on this understanding that the permanent psychiatric morbidity and mortality that they see in veterans is linked to the concept solely of trauma. And when it is made apparent that it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, they're going to look back on their careers and say, what have I done? I've just wasted my life. Now, of course, all science is eventually replaced, right? And so they shouldn't necessarily feel that way. But here's the problem. We've known about this for how long? Over 20 years. The psychiatry community has been repeatedly warned, you probably should look into the effects of mefloquine. And they've said, oh, no, we don't need to look into that, right? So if this was new information, if this was suddenly sprung upon, I could be a little more understanding. But the psychiatry community has almost intentionally ignored this information over the course of many people's careers today. They've completely ignored this possibility.
With millions of research having gone into that.
Well, not millions, like billions. We've spent billions of dollars on this type of research, and they've never once considered the most likely, plausible, prevalent confounder to their research. The idea that this drug that is being given at the exact same time as they're being exposed to traumas and can cause the exact same symptoms that they attribute solely to trauma might be messing up all of their conclusions. They haven't yet acknowledged this.
Yep.
And of course, the longer this goes on, the less likely they are to accept that they've made a mistake.
So what else is in White River Junction?
Well, in White River Junction, and this was one of the reasons why we chose to originally headquarter ourselves there, is the VA's center for the executive center for their for the study of PTSD, whatever it's called. The Center of Research Funding is headquartered there in White River Junction. Of course, while we were present there for the 6 years, made numerous invitations to them to learn more about our work and attend our meetings and at least reach out and learn about the basics. But our numerous invites fell on deaf ears. So I feel very good. History will judge that I tried my best we tried our best to convince the VA, even going all the way up to Vermont, to be right next to them. I feel history will judge us very, very favorably that we tried to make them aware of this. But Mike, it's kind of like, I think it was it John Updike who said this? He said, "You cannot make a man understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." And this is essentially what we're dealing with. There's an entire intellectual academic industry built upon denying the possibility that these symptoms could be due to mefloquine and insisting that they can only be due to trauma. And so it's very difficult to penetrate that that artificial barrier that's been created as a result of these perverse incentives that the funding system sets up. Without if research were conducted the way it was, over 100 years ago, and just individual scientists would get together and talk, and perhaps they would pay for their work out of their own wealth, much as our foundation permits us to do. I think we would have made much more progress on this. But because all of the researchers are beholden to the military and the VA, and because the top leaders of the VA and the military do not yet want to acknowledge this for whatever reason, the entire research community is inevitably not going to arrive at a different conclusion.
And in reality, they're continuing to throw money to solve something without actually separating two possible problems.
Yeah, that's right. Now, I was getting to this topic earlier, but let's explore a little more. There is an interesting potential for some synergy here, and we can discuss this in a little more detail. So, a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder requires meeting criterion A, which is experiencing a certain type of stressor. Now, what constitutes a stressor and what doesn't meet those criteria is a little bit interesting, because if all you do is watch awful snuff films of people dying, and you watch people writhe in pain for the camera in real life, actually having happened, being captured on film, and so through film or television, you experience awful things happening in real life. Sorry, that doesn't qualify. You're not going to get a diagnosis of PTSD. Now, in actual fact, we found a lot of drone pilots who are piloting drones and who watch what they're doing on camera. They're basically developing PTSD from this, not surprisingly. And so the psychiatry community, I think, has bent the rules a little bit for them. But if all you're doing is watching snuff films or the equivalent horror movies, which are probably just as bad because they show some pretty terrible things, you can't get PTSD. So if you see a movie of an awful thing happening, sorry, doesn't qualify. If you happen to be present while the camera is filming and you see the same awful thing happening, that will qualify as a traumatic stressor, and so you might get a diagnosis of PTSD. You can also get a diagnosis of PTSD if you fear something like that will happen. And so if you feared for your life as a result of whatever circumstance, you might qualify for a diagnosis of PTSD. Now, what's interesting is the psychiatrists don't actually get to the question of, well, was your fear reasonable? Was your fear grounded in reality? So, for example, we're sitting across from each other, right? And hopefully you're not perceiving a threat in me, and I'm certainly not perceiving a threat in you. But imagine if I was laboring under a paranoid, delusional psychosis. Imagine if I saw danger everywhere. I'm looking out at the St.Clair River, and there's enemy submarines in the water. And because I'm prone to hallucinating, in the ripples of the water, I actually see a periscope emerge out of the water. Now I'm on alert because now the enemy sees me. The periscope's looking at me, and their submarine is full of Navy SEALs who could jump out and rush this 20 yards to the water and jump up here and kill us, right? So while I'm sitting here having this pleasant conversation with you, for all you know, I might be laboring under these paranoid, delusory ideas that I'm about to be killed, right? And if I don't have insight into my delusion, I might try to keep things together for the interview, but then I might go to my psychiatrist tomorrow and say, oh my God, I almost got killed. I was sitting there having an interview and the SEALs almost took me out. Their submarine was right there and they were fully armed and their lasers were trained on me, right? Now, of course, here in St. Clair County, Michigan, no psychiatrist is going to believe that actually happened. But what if we were in a war zone? And I recount that same story. Oh, Doc, we were out in the field and the bad guys, they were right there. We could hardly see them. They were hidden so well. I was the only one that saw them, but I know they were there. We almost got killed. I'll bet you pretty much every psychiatrist will say, you know what? You're the combat expert. I wasn't there. You say you saw some pretty terrible things. You almost got killed. I'm going to believe you. And maybe 5 times out of 10 or more, that veteran who recounts that story and who has subsequent symptoms of anxiety, nightmares, depression, what have you, will get a diagnosis of PTSD and be eligible for compensation for PTSD. Now, what if that deployment was a walk in the park? What if they happened to have been in the northwest of Afghanistan, where there really isn't much enemy activity? They're just chilling with the good guys there. But they nonetheless recount that story. Why? Because they were laboring under paranoid delusions from their use of Mefloquine. They'll come home from Afghanistan and talk about all the dangerous Taliban that were stalking them in the mountains. And they'll come back with anxiety, nightmares, depression, anxiety, you name it. And everyone will call it PTSD. But was that individual, was that veteran actually ever in any danger? No, because the danger was all in their mind. They were hallucinating the danger. They were imagining the danger. The effects of Mefloquine were creating paranoia and anxiety and filling their minds with all sorts of crazy ideas that a psychiatrist later on just uncritically accepted. This is why we might be dealing with an epidemic of unrecognized Mefloquine poisoning. It's merely masquerading as PTSD. And in this particular case, unless the veteran ever develops insight, they might never even suspect that it was the Mefloquine. Because they believe the
story that was in their head.
That was in their head. Right. And so merely making veterans aware that this drug can have these effects and can create the sense of danger when no danger is actually present. This can actually be very therapeutic, because what I've found in dealing with many veterans is they can't make sense of things. They come back thinking, well, I guess it's PTSD, but something's not right because their buddies don't have it. And there's just certain things that are off about their story. And they wonder, well, the psychiatrist is telling me I have PTSD, but it doesn't really make sense to me. If they're finally told, look, all of these effects you experienced, this might have just been the drug. This deployment might actually not have been as bad as you think. It might have just been the effects of the drug. This could be very therapeutic because they realize, now everything makes sense. I'm not crazy. Well, in a sense, they sort of are crazy, but at least they have insight now into their craziness. And once someone has insight into their psychosis, then in many respects, they're better because they're now able to see it. A psychosis or a delusion or a misinterpretation that you don't have insight into can be much more morbid. It can be much more disabling than one where you finally recognize it, because then you can begin to control it.
Or heal, or to get help, or to do things to mitigate.
I think it's mitigating because so that example of the paranoia. Let's suppose I was suffering from these Mefloquine effects, and so I was prone to paranoia. I was prone to seeing things, And let's suppose I was sitting here and I sense, okay, there's a submarine in the water and its periscope is coming, and I might be able to say, okay, hold on a second, this is not actually happening. This is the Mefloquine talking. I am perfectly safe here. This is St. Clair County, Michigan, Canada across the way. The most dangerous thing around here is maybe, going to Tim Hortons and them not having, crullers, right? Like they'll be able to realize it's not so bad. It's not bad.
Yeah.
Once you recognize the demons for what they are, you can work through it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, isn't there cases like of units that deployed and didn't deploy to necessarily a war zone,
Right?
and that a majority of those units came away with away with PTSD.
So what you're describing is this sort of implausible scenario where a military unit taking mefloquine or a related drug such as tefenequine deploys on a humanitarian mission or deploys to an area where there really isn't active combat and nonetheless suffers an unusually high level of psychiatric morbidity that is attributed to post-traumatic stress disorder. And probably the best example of this is the experience of Australian veterans who deployed to I forget the name. East Timor. Thank you, yeah. East Timor, which is north of the Australian continent, during an unstable period, but on what was ostensibly a humanitarian mission. And to compare the conditions that they encountered with the conditions experienced by, for example, Australian troops in actual combat in other theaters, I think does the veterans a disservice. Many veterans of the East Timor deployment will readily attest the most stressful thing that they encountered was a steep hill that they had to climb up. And despite this, an unusually large number of them returned from this deployment after having taken mefloquine or tefenequine with permanent psychiatric symptoms that the investigators on the drug trial were all too happy to attribute to undisclosed stressors. And so their permanent psychiatric disability was automatically excluded from consideration as a drug effect because, of course, it had to be PTSD, right?
Yeah.
So, and this raises a broader issue that the public needs to be made aware of, that the safety of these drugs, chloroquine, quinacrine, quinine, mefloquine, primaquine, tefenequine,
hydroxychloroquine.
Hydroxychloroquine to a certain extent, yeah. But most of the safety data for these drugs that has been considered historically and even today by drug regulators has some connection to some sort of military study. It's military veterans, military service people on combat deployments or on humanitarian deployments, such as in East Timor, who provide much of the evidence to infer the safety and efficacy of these drugs. And this is problematic for several reasons, right? Because in this particular example, if there's some other explanation for the development of psychiatric symptoms, oh, well, your nightmares and anxiety and insomnia, that can't be the drug. That must be PTSD. Let's not even consider it in our analysis. If this happens on a regular basis, then civilians might come to the conclusion that these drugs are safer than they are.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, this is what's happened, right? Because when mefloquine was originally licensed, the drug company didn't even mention the possibility of psychiatric symptoms with prophylactic use. And now, of course, we know that's certainly not the case.
Was it 2015 or something when they changed it to a black box label? Or
so the history of mefloquine labeling is very interesting. So when the drug was first made available in the United States, it had been available in several other jurisdictions for maybe 3, 4, 5 years. And prior to that, it had been widely deployed throughout Southeast Asia. And looking back, I suspect the main reason it was so widely used in areas like Thailand was simply to flood the market with the drug so that the drug company could claim that it has been used successfully millions and millions of times. If you drop 1 million doses of this drug into a war-torn area and you have people comment about how effective it is at treating malaria, and you don't bother to do any real study of psychiatric side effects, and any psychiatric effects that are seen in the population are conveniently attributed to the fact these are war refugees, then you're going to conclude this exercise by saying, we've used this drug millions of times for treatment of malaria. It's very effective, and we haven't identified any safety signals. And this is precisely what happened, Mike. And so by the time the drug became available for use in European populations, Europeans who were haplessly taking this drug were told, oh, we've used it millions of times, it's perfectly safe. Don't worry about it. But the truth has this, inconvenient way of coming out. And soon after the drug was used in European markets, there were these episodes of psychosis and confusion and what was described as organic brain syndrome, acute amnesia, memory loss. These were not uncommonly reported, and so the drug company had to do something about this. And so they did acknowledge that these symptoms were certainly possible with treatment doses of mefloquine. But by the time the drug was initially licensed in the U.S., the safety data that had been submitted, the studies showing efficacy and side effects in people administered one drug a week, there wasn't any reference at all to psychiatric effects. The drug company didn't acknowledge any risk of psychiatric effects from prophylactic use of the drug. And that raises the question, well, why then did the drug company's attorneys insist upon adding language to the product insert that said, if during prophylactic use of the drug you develop psychiatric symptoms, anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion, these must be considered prodromal to a more serious event, and the drug must be discontinued. Where did this come from? Why did the attorneys insist on adding this language to the product label if there wasn't any evidence of psychiatric symptoms with prophylactic use of the drug?
Yeah.
Well, obviously the lawyers knew a little bit more than was admitted to FDA. And of course, very soon after all of this came out, the World Health Organization published a number of studies very concerned about the high frequency of these effects. And many people didn't believe it because they didn't even recognize that this drug could even enter the brain.
Yeah.
In fact, the reviewers that were looking over this drug application at the FDA, they had no idea if the drug could penetrate into brain. And so if the drug couldn't get into brain, how could it possibly have these effects? Well, they were simply misinformed because we knew by that point that the drug could actually penetrate the brain. Yeah. And I think this speaks to another issue, which is the FDA knew that the military wanted this drug. The only reason Roche at the time was bringing it to market was because the military wanted it to come to market. Now, why Roche agreed to bring this drug to market for the military is beyond me, because apparently the historical documentation shows that the military approached 3 or 4 other drug manufacturers in the 70s trying to get this drug commercialized. And they all basically said, no way. We're not touching that with a 10-foot pole. But for some reason, Roche acquiesced and agreed. Now, whether there was some relationship between Roche and the U.S. military that might have affected that decision is unclear. Roche apparently was manufacturing chemical weapons for the U.S. at one point, so that might have something to do with it. Or there may be a deeper connection that we could explore maybe on a different podcast. But nonetheless, Roche agreed to develop this drug. And it's very obvious that they were uncomfortable with this relationship all along. Roche knew that essentially hiding the truth would take a monumental effort. They would need to manufacture doubt about the dangers of this drug. Now, there have been several examples in history of corporate interests successfully manufacturing doubt about the known toxic dangers of various things. The lead industry, classic for doing so. The tobacco industry, very well known for doing so. We really knew everything we needed to know in the 50s about how dangerous tobacco smoke was. But the tobacco industry was expert at saying, well, don't be too quick to rush to judgment. There are lots of other explanations for why smokers might develop lung cancer. For example, smokers drink a lot. What do? You smoke while you're in the bar. Maybe this is confounding. Maybe it's not the cigarettes. Maybe it's all the alcohol that they're drinking. that's causing them to develop lung cancer, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
And if you hire the best minds and you pay them a lot of money, you might enter public health school. You might decide to become an epidemiologist, motivated by trying to serve the public. But being a assistant professor doesn't pay very much. And if a tobacco company dangles $500 an hour in front of you to testify as an expert witness, you might compromise your integrity to give your wife and kids a better life. And we've seen this happen time and time again, where companies are successful in manufacturing doubt. And absolutely, unequivocally, Roche and a series of partners conspired to manufacture doubt about the known dangers of Lariam or Mefloquine, beginning in the late 80s, early 90s. In fact, the entire discipline of travel medicine, which now is respected, actually emerged from a deliberate effort on the part of some close Roche employees and affiliates to manufacture civilian demand for Lariam and also address concerns about its safety. So the initial scientific literature was actually controlled by a small cabal of people with connections to Roche or connections to the military or the US government that had a vested interest in keeping this information from the public. And this is why you don't see any acknowledgement in the literature about these warnings that appeared in the label. So the label was saying all along, if you take Mefloquine and you develop anxiety, stop taking the drug. That's bad. This could be an indication of a personal susceptibility to the drug that requires you to immediately discontinue it.
Yeah.
And yet, if you review all the papers written in these early years by people like Schlegenhoff and authors affiliated with the CDC and the military, they don't even acknowledge these warnings. Schlegenhoff was a pharmacist. You would think that a pharmacist of all people would acknowledge the warnings in the drug label, but Schlegenhoff never once acknowledged that you cannot take this drug if you develop symptoms of, for example, anxiety. Nowhere does that appear. Even to this day, I don't think she's acknowledged that. And it was many, many years until these prodromal symptoms were even acknowledged as being causally due to the drug. It was really only in 2001, with publication of the first real randomized blinded trial of Mefloquine versus a drug that wasn't suspected of having these effects, that we saw this very significant increase in the incidence of things like nightmares, insomnia, anxiety, depression. So this was the first rock solid, undisputable evidence from a randomized clinical trial. But there's plenty of other evidence from various other types of studies in the decades preceding that study that made it very clear these symptoms did frequently occur. And this was all swept under the rug through the efforts of Roche and their affiliates to manufacture doubt about the real dangers of this drug. And of course, this period encompasses many of the larger military uses of this drug, right? So during Somalia, this stuff was swept under the rug. Special forces use of the drug throughout the 90s. And then even at the start of the 9/11 wars, the post 9/11 wars, this information hadn't yet disseminated out into the medical community. So even though this critical study was published in 2001, many people were simply unaware of these findings with the start of the Afghanistan war and into the start of the Iraq war. And it was really only around the time that I started publishing about this that I think the medical community acknowledged that at prophylactic doses, this drug could have these effects and that these occurred quite commonly. But if you were paying even the slightest bit of attention to this issue, you would have known this in the late 80s.
Say, talking about PTS and Mefloquine poisoning, the treatment for both is different, right? And not really anything for Mefloquine?
Well, it's difficult to know for sure, Mike, because when we say a treatment for a condition works, we're generally referring to some evidence from studies, right? Prior to the era of evidence-based medicine, treatments were often just pulled out of a hat by a doctor, and if it worked in their experience, they used a little more, and that sort of creates positive feedback where the doctor decides, hey, this is working pretty good. But in some cases, the treatment actually didn't show real evidence of efficacy. It was just misperceived as being effective. In order to know if a particular treatment is effective for a particular condition, there needs to be certain conditions met. You need to do a study, right? And the study needs to enroll enough people to have statistical power. And ideally, what you would do is you would control for all the sort of random things that might affect the outcome. So let's say for post-traumatic stress disorder, you want to find a large number, let's just say 2,000 people
Yep.
that are known to have post-traumatic stress disorder. And as we mentioned, you got to make sure they don't have something else. You got to make sure they actually have post-traumatic stress disorder. So assuming you have 2,000 people that you found with post-traumatic stress disorder, now you need to subject them to the experiment. So let's just divide them in half. You give 1,000 a sugar pill, let's say, and you give 1,000 this drug, let's say an antidepressant drug.
Yeah.
Maybe you make the sugar pill a little bitter so that if you bite into it, you might think it's medicine, because if it's sugar, you're going to know. You're going to be unblinded to your treatment. And the people shouldn't know. The researchers shouldn't know who's getting what, and the patients shouldn't know who's getting what. They shouldn't be able to tell from the pill what they're getting, placebo or antidepressant.
Yeah.
And then you just follow them for however long that they agree to continue in this trial. And every now and then you ask them how they're feeling. You feeling depressed? You feeling okay? And then let's say at the end of a year or so, you do a final tally. You figure out, all right, well, who still has PTSD and who's been cured, right? And then you unblind everyone. You figure out who's been taking the sugar pill and who's been taking the medicine, and then you just crunch the numbers. And you might find that 100 fewer people in the treatment arm have PTSD at the end of the trial.
Yep.
Right. So I don't know. Let's say 100 spontaneously improved in each arm. So 900 have PTSD in the sugar pill arm, and 800 have PTSD in the treatment arm. Well, then you say, oh, actually, it's pretty effective. This antidepressant's fairly effective for treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. You have scientific evidence, good quality scientific evidence for treatment. Okay, but you see what this study depended on. It depended on having an accurate diagnosis and large enough numbers of patients to enroll.
Yep.
So with the case of mefloquine poisoning, or what we call quinism, or what we might perhaps more generally call chronic mefloquine encephalopathy, which is an accurate description of what it is. It's a chronic, long-lasting dysfunction of the brain, encephalopathy, caused by a toxic exposure to mefloquine. So chronic toxic mefloquine encephalopathy, or mefloquine encephalopathy, or just quinism, is a condition that I'm confident will be able to be reliably identified. But we're not yet at the point where I can go out and call up a bunch of doctors and say, hey, recruit cases of chronic mefloquine encephalopathy for me. I want to do a study. Because they'll say, well, hold on, what's the case definition? What are the actual diagnostic criteria? We're not yet at the point where we can say that. Now, it's sort of like what those Supreme Court justices said about pornography. You know it when you see it, but that's not good enough in this context. Yeah. We have to formally define it on the basis of either some biomarker or on the basis of some combination of symptoms or science. Now, I would loosely define this condition as a chronic psychiatric or neuropsychiatric condition that develops and persists in the aftermath of taking mefloquine and experiencing prodromal symptoms during use, and that is not better explained by some other condition. That's a reasonable working definition, right? So if you start taking mefloquine and you develop nightmares of your disemboweling your daughter and raping her disemboweled corpse, which was actually a dream that somebody recounted to me. So this is not my idea. This is what a veteran told me. Oh, and enjoying it. So if these are your nightmares, and you feel comfortable actually reporting that to your psychiatrist, well, okay, that's actually a very good data point, as disturbing as it is, because this clearly can't be the result of combat trauma, right? And then when did these nightmares develop? Oh, doc, they developed immediately after I started taking Mefloquine, within a week, right? Well, what other symptoms are you experiencing? Well, doc, obviously, I've thought about killing myself many times because, God forbid, I actually ever do that to my daughter. I must be a terrible person for dreaming it. Maybe I might do it one day. No, that's not going to happen. Well, still, okay, I'm suicidal. So vivid nightmares, insomnia, because who wants to go to sleep if that's what they're going to dream of, right? Suicidality, and of course they're anxious. Maybe they're anxious solely for that reason, or maybe they're anxious also as an effect of methadone. Whatever. A combination, a constellation of psychiatric symptoms. And oh, by the way, this guy is dizzy. He has vertigo, and he went to a doctor, and the doctor localized the likely source of his vertigo to the brainstem. So now he has neurologic symptoms, which can be localized to the brainstem, and he has very distinct psychiatric symptoms, such as these odd nightmares, which don't have another good explanation. And they occurred soon after his use of Mefloquine and have persisted ever since. That's Mefloquine poisoning. There really isn't another good explanation for that. So I'm very confident we'll be able to formalize diagnostic criteria for this. And I might get around to actually doing this and writing up a paper and doing this. But I really don't think that's really what's impeding progress in this area. This will come in due course. But regardless, once this case definition is loosely agreed upon by enough clinicians, then we can start enrolling patients and trying various things. And so a treatment, I think, will eventually emerge from all of this. But we can't do studies of treatments until we have done this necessary preparatory work, including formalizing some sort of case definition. And ideally, I would like to see other doctors do this. Ideally, I would like to see other doctors recognize this is an area just ripe for study, and there's a wealth of studies that could be performed. And I'd like to see other people take the lead on that. Here's what I can tell you. I do have some anecdotal experience, obviously, because I've heard from hundreds and hundreds of Mefloquine veterans, and I've heard their stories about what they've tried and what they think works and what doesn't work. And I also know a little bit about the likely underlying pathophysiology, like what's actually going wrong in the brain to cause these problems, right? So we know the drug is neurotoxic. We know it's inducing a toxic encephalopathy. And this toxic encephalopathy and the drug's neurotoxicity, we think, can damage permanently certain neurons in certain parts of the central nervous system. Particularly, we think the hippocampus, the area responsible for memory, including processing fear memories from the amygdala, and also areas of the brainstem. It seems to mostly spare the cortex, the outer part of the brain, but all of the sort of inner, deeper, more ancient areas of the brain, the parts of the brain that we sort of share with, lizards and alligators, like the deep primal parts of the brain, the limbic system. This is the area of the brain that's affected. And it could very well be that there are certain types of neurons. There's many types of neurons. They come in all shapes and sizes. And it could be that certain types of neurons are more susceptible to this effect. Interneurons, for example, can cause inhibition and stop an out of control reaction in certain parts of the brain. And it could be, I'm not certain about this, but it could be that certain interneurons are particularly at risk of this type of toxicity. And if that's the case, then it's reasonable to think that some of the symptoms we see in Mefloquine poisoning are actually similar to symptoms of seizure. Not the type of seizure that we normally associate with that term, the sort of flailing of all the limbs, grand mal seizures. We do see that with Mefloquine. We do see grand mal seizures with typically treatment doses of Mefloquine. But I'm not referring to those kind of seizures. I'm referring to a deep brain seizure, a seizure deep in the limbic system, what sometimes are referred to as temporal lobe seizures. If this drug creates a locus or a nidus for a deep brain seizure and causes intermittent activity, seizure-like activity in certain parts of the brain, that might explain the intermittent psychotic or paranoid-like features that some veterans complain of. Some veterans report being okay for a few days or a few weeks at a time, and then having essentially spells. They have spells. And during these spells, they can become acutely psychotic. That to me sounds like a seizure. That sounds like a temporal lobe seizure. And if you look up the typical presentation of a temporal lobe seizure, it sounds a lot like what many Mefloquine veterans are describing. Not all, but some. So what might be the treatment for that? Well, the typical anti-epileptic treatments. Some Mefloquine veterans report some degree of success with that, but I can't say if enough report that for it to be reliable. I know many veterans struggle with uncontrollable anxiety, and they take drugs like benzodiazepines in an attempt to treat their symptoms. And I think that's universally acknowledged as being very unhelpful. It controls their symptoms, it doesn't really treat the underlying problem, and causes all sorts of problems, separate from mefloquine. So certainly, long-term treatment with benzos or anxiety drugs is probably not the solution. There's been some interest in things like stellate ganglion block. Stellate ganglion block.
That's the
injection.
the doctors out of Chicago,
right, and elsewhere, but yes, Chicago, right?
Or it's Dr. Lippitz, or
I believe so, and we may be butchering his name, but that is the individual you're thinking of. I wrote a paper on this stellate ganglion block specifically for post-traumatic stress disorder, but I did wonder, and I did share this with some of the authors in the field. I did wonder whether some of the subjects that they had enrolled in these studies weren't actually just suffering from mefloquine poisoning. So that literature might be corrupted to a certain degree by effects of mefloquine poisoning, confounding some of their work. But I've heard anecdotally from some veterans who've tried stellate ganglion block that they thought it was effective. And there's some good theoretical pathophysiological reasoning to suggest that might actually work. Ketamine's been discussed. Some people have tried ketamine and reported good results. But all of these things carry risks, right? All of these treatments carry risks, and we don't have good evidence to support their use. So when a doctor writes me or calls me up and says, Dr. Nevin, I have someone with mefloquine poisoning, what might you suggest? I tell them, I can't tell them, from an evidence-based perspective. Yeah, I mean, obviously, feel free to try all these things. You're the doctor. But what I tell them is this: I say, what I've heard from an increasing number of veterans is that ketosis, of all things, seems to help. And just for some context, childhood epilepsy, childhood seizures were once, and I think even today they still are, but this was once the cornerstone of therapy, inducing a permanently ketotic state. So switching the body over from glucose metabolism to ketone metabolism, basically having the body burn fat instead of starches and sugars for fuel. What that seems to do is it seems to stabilize the brain. Sugar seems to be pretty bad for the brain. Well, as any parent of a 2-year-old will attest, sugar makes you a little overactive, right?
Yeah.
And so that same concept might apply in adulthood. And if your brain has been injured by mefloquine, if you have a toxic encephalopathic state, maybe sugar is not the best thing for your brain. Maybe a soothing, calming ketotic state is better. And in the same way that a ketotic state, meaning induction of ketosis, limiting your carbohydrates, avoiding pure sugars, pure glucose whenever possible, within reason, within bounds of good health, inducing a permanent ketotic state seems to induce beneficial effects even in people without mefloquine poisoning.
Yeah.
Many people who've gone on ketotic diets will tell you they just feel much better. Their focus is clearer, their concentration is sharper, their mood is better, they're less distractible. And there are an increasing number of clinicians who argue that really the first line of therapy for psychiatric disease should be inducing ketosis and then add drugs as necessary on top of that. But inducing ketosis should be a first step. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating that. That's outside of my area of expertise, but I am aware of a growing number of clinicians who advocate for that. So I can't make any recommendations, obviously. But I have heard now several very compelling stories from Mefloquine veterans who were a mess. They were suffering full-on psychotic breaks intermittently, associated with rage and anger, landing one of them in prison for life
Yep.
for a fairly grisly act, essentially all but cured from their adoption of a ketotic diet, completely incidentally for weight loss. And then they discovered these incidental beneficial effects. Now, are there any real harms to attempting to induce ketosis?
Yeah.
Probably not. Always ask your doctor. But there's no drugs involved. There's no dangerous procedures involved. It's free, and you get to enjoy delicious steak and seafood and cheese and butter. What's not to love? Right?
That's the main, main diet for that?
Well, a ketotic diet can be adhered to in several ways, but the best way to enjoy a ketotic diet is to have a couple eggs in the morning and some bacon, maybe. Delicious shrimp cocktail for lunch and a juicy steak for dinner. All of that is low carbohydrate, and of course, add some vegetables to make your doctor happy. But all of that is ketosis friendly. It won't induce an insulin response. It's full of good healthy proteins and fats to help you fuel your brain. It can be a little expensive, eating juicy steaks can get a little expensive, but you're worth it. And the money you save on junk food, you can put towards that. Very few risks from that. Obviously, you talk to your doctor about cholesterol and so on, but this myth that eating a ketotic diet or eating a carnivore diet or eating a high fat, high protein diet is associated with any significant health risks such as metabolic disorder, risk of heart disease. A lot of that's been debunked. I mean, humans evolved under conditions of a diet similar to that, with intermittent feasting on berries and things like that. But humanity is optimally evolved to eat a high fat, high protein ketotic diet. And in this particular case, there seems to be some pretty strong anecdotal evidence that it might help. So I think, well, there's very very few harms, good potential upside, and it's delicious. So why not? Now, I've been on that diet many times in my life. As you can see, I'm not currently, but it's aspirational. I think it's good for people to at least consider. I think the last thing Mefloquine veterans want to be doing, though, is eating large amounts of sugar. Whether ketosis is a treatment or not, I just don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah. Just I took a Red Bull one time about 5 years ago. I bought a case, and then I think I drank one can, and I was like raging for like an hour or 2 hours, enough to say that when I finished, I was like, the Red Bull's gone.
Well, there you go. And of course, it's probably not just Red Bull. It's probably any of these caffeinated beverages. Yeah, and every Mefloquine veteran has sort of, I think, after recognizing what it is they're suffering from and coming to terms with the condition, and maybe speaking with their clinicians and maybe weaning off unhelpful or unproven therapies, which is reasonable in this setting. I think after a certain number of months or years, every veteran learns for themselves what works and doesn't work. One thing that many Mefloquine veterans will note is that their vestibular symptoms often drive the psychiatric aspect of their condition. So for veterans who might be in a good place mentally, maybe they don't suffer from paranoia or delusions or psychosis, but do experience intermittent anxiety, which they find very troubling, and who also have a prominent vestibular component, meaning they're dizzy all the time, they get vertiginous episodes, they're unsteady on their feet, they might have problems with their vision. Treating their vestibular dysfunction can often do much to improve their anxiety and possibly also any cognitive dysfunction they may be having. Because imagine this. Imagine you're psychiatrically very well, but your vestibular system is feeding you bad information. You know that feeling you get when you suddenly come across a cliff edge and you suddenly find yourself on the edge of a cliff, or you're watching a YouTube video of someone doing parkour or jumping off, the top of a mountain. you get anxious, you get scared,
Yeah.
you become psychiatrically disturbed by visual inputs alone of an acutely unstable environment. So you can induce, and there are examples of this. I remember I was at the Toronto Science Center one day, and they actually set up this scenario where you'd be walking down a hallway and be surprised by what you perceived as a very sharp, deep cliff. And I would just sit there and watch, and many people would be like, they would scream, they would panic because they were fooled. Their mind was fooled by abnormal sensory input that made them think they were at risk of falling and dying.
Yeah.
Well, that same sense of anxiety and fear and panic can be induced on a regular or recurring basis by abnormal signals coming from the vestibular system of someone who's been injured by mefloquine.
Yeah.
So if your vestibular system is off because you've had brainstem dysfunction from mefloquine, you've suffered mefloquine encephalopathy, your vestibular system is potentially constantly feeding you signals that your life is in danger. It may be constantly or intermittently sending you signals that are equivalent to your being on the edge of a cliff.
Yep.
And certain environments can trigger this. So driving over a bridge, driving through a tunnel where there's flashing lights, being on a boat, or even being under fluorescent lighting. One thing that commonly sets people off is being in a supermarket, of all things, where you got these long aisles and it's sort of disorienting and you got the flickering fluorescent lights. Some veterans will come home from war and they find they can't go to a supermarket. There's actually a name for this. It's called supermarket syndrome.
Huh.
And supermarket syndrome is a known manifestation of some vestibular disorders. But we also see supermarket syndrome with many mefloquine veterans. It's the exact same thing. Now, if they treat their vestibular disorder, if they go to vestibular therapy and they work on strengthening other pathways and they work on balance and they constantly try to push themselves in a controlled way to improve their vestibular compensation, basically hardcore vestibular therapy. If they work on this for weeks or months or even years, find some activity that constantly stresses and tests their vestibular system, then a lot of this anxiety and this cognitive dysfunction associated with these panic states can go away. And so many veterans find they can eliminate much of their disability through this kind of therapy. So some of the anxiety, some of the cognitive dysfunction that's reported in mefloquine veterans, and then the usual agitation, irritability, and all the social problems with relationships that go with that. Much of that might be related to vestibular dysfunction. So getting a good vestibular evaluation and getting that treated, I think, is key. But for those mefloquine veterans that are suffering from this intermittent psychosis, a loss of reality, right, or who experienced very significant confusion during their initial use of the drug, who basically lost touch with reality and became dissociated, that indicates to me something going on with their hippocampus, not just their brainstem. And that is a much more, that's a separate manifestation of pathology that vestibular treatment alone is not going to manage. So, perhaps some combination of ketosis and vestibular therapy in people who have very significant disability might work. But again, all of this needs to be tested.
Then just I listened to a book. I think it was the Brain That Heals Itself,
Okay.
and that's where they were dealing with people that they referred to as wobblers. So their cochlea or whatever was damaged. So then they couldn't walk upright for like more than 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And it was a Russian doctor that started to treat him with like a helmet, and then they placed something on the tongue and it sent signals through the tongue.
Okay.
Or something like this. And then if they wore the helmet, right, if they wore it the longer they wore it, then the longer the effects would be mitigated.
Oh, that's interesting. All right.
So they say they would wear the helmet for 15 minutes and that would give them 2 weeks of walking.
Yeah, maybe there's some sort of a feedback involving other parts of the brainstem, because you mentioned the tongue. I don't doubt that we will develop some fairly innovative and novel therapies for this in due course. I do think treatment's possible. And I think what treatment will require is understanding the underlying pathophysiology of this condition. So fundamentally, what mefloquine encephalopathy represents is a potentially multifocal and somewhat random pattern of injury to various areas of the deep brain and brainstem and limbic system. It might affect the hippocampus. It might affect the joining areas in the limbic system. It might affect primarily areas in the brainstem, and not just the vestibular nuclei. It might affect the vagus nerve nuclei. It might affect the other cranial nerve nuclei. So, for example, I've long noted this uncanny association between mefloquine encephalopathy and sleep apnea. And how does this make sense? Because sleep apnea is a physical obstruction of the airway. Sometimes it's the tongue that just won't get out of the way, but it's a physical, mechanical process. So how can mefloquine poisoning possibly cause obstructive sleep apnea? Well, then it occurred to me, the tongue needs to get out of the way to breathe at night. And there's a rhythmic innervation of the tongue that occurs normally as part of regular sleep that's mediated by the brainstem. And in fact, there's a treatment for obstructive sleep apnea that involves replacing the natural rhythmic activation of the tongue with a little electrical device sits on your neck, and it does the rhythmic activation of the tongue muscles as you breathe. It basically gets the tongue out of the way every time you breathe.
Huh.
So it could very well be that one aspect of mefloquine encephalopathy in folks with fairly severe disease is obstructive sleep apnea. And so that laryngeal nerve stimulation might very well be an effective treatment for this manifestation. So developing treatments for this condition will require us to recognize its diverse manifestations. And pretty much when you start messing with the brainstem, when you start messing with the cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem, all bets are off, because you wouldn't believe the range of unusual physical conditions that can be ultimately attributed to problems in the brainstem. It's such an unusual area for pathology that we're not generally trained to recognize these signs. Or if we see signs that might be attributable to problems in the brainstem, we're usually apt to attribute them to some other downstream process. Like problems with the vestibular nerve nuclei are often attributed to problems in the inner ear, because how often does the vestibular nerve nuclei get affected? Hardly ever. So it must be something in the inner ear, right? How often does something happen in your brainstem that affects innervation of the tongue? Hardly ever. Maybe it's something with the nerve, or maybe the patient's just fat and their airways obstructed. So it's really easy to miss the fundamental etiology. So I'm excited. I'm fairly confident that in due course, and all of this will require the VA and the DoD to make some sort of acknowledgement. Yes, we goofed. Yes, this is a problem. Yes, we need to start looking at how many people have been affected. We need to get a grip on how bad this problem is. Once this happens, once there's that acknowledgement, and once we start screening veterans for this exposure of interest, and then clinicians themselves start to recognize these associations, you're going to see rapid progress in this area, because this will be an exciting area for clinical research and exploration. There's going to be hopefully all sorts of money poured into it once the DoD and VA acknowledge this problem. And we may see all sorts of innovative treatments, but it all rests on clinicians recognizing this potential in their patients. And, so long as every psychiatrist just attributes nightmares, regardless of their content, in someone who's been to war as absolutely reflecting PTSD, as long as that happens, until psychiatrists accept maybe it's not PTSD, maybe it's both PTSD and mefloquine poisoning, but until they recognize that it might be something else, I don't see us making significant progress. So we're really it's kind of like a dam bursting. Like once you make just a little bit of progress, once you take a little bit of sand, then
it eats away and it's gone.
The evidence that's out there, the accumulated patient burden, the fact that none of this stuff makes sense, right? Like, how can somebody have PTSD when their nightmares started before deployment. There's so many things in many veterans' history that just doesn't make any sense. It's just been dismissed. This is like a force. This is like the water accumulating behind a dam. There's this overwhelming force that's been contained by a small number of bureaucrats that have been obstructing this process. But once these bureaucrats retire, I hate to say it, as Pascal said, science progresses one funeral at a time. Once some of these old timers pass away or retire, then a new generation is going to come in, and this dam will be eroded more and more. And eventually the trickle will turn into a stream, and then it'll just be a gush of progress. And it'll be like night and day. Veterans who can't even get their clinician to pronounce mefloquine correctly, maybe 10 years from now, they're going to get a diagnosis of mefloquine poisoning thrown at them even before they get in the door. It'll be that sudden and dramatic a change. And I'm confident it's going to happen. We just need some catalyst to trigger this process beginning.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was going to, the one book, I was trying to find it here, that talked about the lift, let's see, about face, 15 days. The Invisible Machine is what it talks about.
No. They're referring to the brain.
I don't have my glasses in, but
no. Oh, that's right. Of course, yeah, Lipov. That's the gentleman. Yeah. So we were talking about who was the a doctor innovating in the area of stellate ganglion block. It is Eugene Lipov. Yeah, out of Chicago.
They call that a double sympathetic reset.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, and that may be very therapeutic. It from a number of case reports, it does sound like stellate ganglion block can definitely work in some people. But again, we have to test this.
Everything is got to be tested, tried.
Yeah, I think so. Now, how medical treatments are initially discovered is through the process of experimentation, the development of novel hypotheses. Doctors will tinker, either on themselves in some cases or with informed consent on a small number of patients, and then based on accumulation of anecdotal evidence, formal trials will be proposed. Yeah. And I think some of the treatments that will eventually be proposed for this will be so obviously beneficial that they may even be widely adopted even without this sort of formal study. But we'll see. We'll see. All of this in due course. This may happen next year. It may happen 5 years from now, maybe 10 years. The community will recognize mefloquine encephalopathy and mefloquine poisoning on its own schedule, subject to various other factors. And it could be that our time is approaching, right? We've recognized that the veteran community has been focused on things like burn pits, on the Blue Water Navy problem, the outstanding Agent Orange veterans who haven't yet been recognized, and that these admittedly larger problems, because they affect a cumulative larger number of people, that these problems take precedence. But now, if you ask the veterans community, okay, what big problems are on your radar screen? Not a whole lot of other service-connected conditions. So it may be time for Quineism or mefloquine encephalopathy to take the stage, front and center. And it may be time for us to start our advocacy efforts in earnest, because I think it may very well be our time now.
Yeah. And most of the neurotoxic effects of mefloquine or of that drug, those are all known effects that have been around since, like Adabrin.
Well, I think now that because the individuals and organizations and interests that worked so hard to manufacture doubt about the causal effects of these drugs are no longer active. Roche is no longer funding people like Schlegenhoff and Stefan to write articles blaming all of this on travelers abusing drugs while they're overseas. Nobody is manufacturing doubt anymore. The money's dried up. They don't care.
Yeah.
So because nobody's manufacturing doubt, the truth is unopposed.
Yeah.
And I think there is a general, well, with one exception, with the exception of new drugs in the class that are being marketed, but there's very little real effort in that regard, and they're not doing so well financially. So I don't expect much from them. But regardless, there's so much growing awareness that is unopposed by manufactured doubt that these drugs are causally associated with these effects.
Yeah.
That I think many clinicians now, when they see a Mefloquine veteran and the veteran talks to them, they do just a little bit of research. They're much more apt now to agree with the veteran.
Yeah.
So I think all this bodes well. I think this means we're probably on the verge of a paradigm shift, and this is actually how medicine evolves. We think of medicine evolving gradually with steps towards the goal, but that's really not how medicine evolves. Medicine evolves through a series of sharp punctuations. So, our example, our understanding of hiatal hernias, of acid reflux, once attributed all of that to stress. Oh, you're working too hard at the office. You need to take a break. Well, and then a couple of doctors said, no, we actually think it's a bacterial infection that's causing this. And they experimented on themselves and did a little bit of rudimentary research. And then the evidence in support of this was so overwhelmingly strong that the medical community almost immediately said, yes, we were wrong. They're right. And the treatment for this problem is now an antibiotic.
Yeah.
And the same thing I think will happen with mefloquine poisoning. All the veterans who are suffering this now know how hard it's been to convince their clinician about this or to get anyone to acknowledge this.
Yeah.
But you have to prepare yourself for a change that will happen here in due course, where you'll go to your doctor and they'll say, oh, yeah, mefloquine, that stuff's terrible. I've been reading all about it. Yeah, pretty bad stuff.
Yeah.
And before you even get to the doctor, they'll say, oh, yeah, we think you have mefloquine poisoning. Yeah, it says here you took mefloquine in Afghanistan and you developed nightmares before you got to combat. Well, it's pretty obviously mefloquine poisoning. It'll be that simple. Yeah. It'll be that obvious. It just requires this paradigm shift to occur in the medical profession. And it will happen if a single official at some high level in DOD, VA, Canadians, UK, Ireland, if some single official acknowledges it. And this is why these legal cases that are underway are potentially so impactful, because potentially as part of any sort of legal settlement or potentially as a result of victories in the courtroom, these officials will essentially have to make some sort of concession like that. And once that occurs, then we'll see the floodgates open. And this is not all that different than what we've seen with various other toxicants, various other toxic torts. Like, for example, people forget that even into the 80s and 90s, there was some scientific discussion that cigarette smoking might not be as dangerous as we thought. Yeah. And all of this finally got litigated in court, where these supposed experts that write these papers actually have to defend themselves under cross-examination, which is very difficult for a lot of people because they write their papers in a clever way where they sort of lie without lying, but it's very easy to expose if you ask them direct questions that they have to answer. So once a lot of this science gets subjected to rigorous cross-examination in legal settings, then the truth comes out and you realize the emperor is not wearing any clothes. And then after that, no one would admit to ever doubting these conclusions. And that happened with tobacco. It happened with various toxic contaminants like lead, and it will happen with mefloquine. After these cases get fully litigated and all the supposed experts that are arguing this isn't a problem are subjected to rigorous, lengthy cross-examination where everything they've said is looked at under a fine-tooth comb, either they break or they say, you know what, okay, I'm wrong, or at least I'm not right. Once all of this comes out, then I think, kind of like roaches scurrying, you're going to be hard pressed to find anyone that argues mefloquine or these related drugs were ever safe. Yeah. And people will be saying, "Oh, I knew it all along."
Yeah, right. Of course. Now, do you know, like when the Airborne Regiment went to Somalia, Do you know what some of the other countries were using when they deployed?
We didn't need to use mefloquine in the early 90s. In fact, when mefloquine was first brought to market, we had other perfectly suitable alternatives. We had doxycycline, and we've always had doxycycline. Doxycycline's a wonderful drug. It's great in military settings. Doxycycline is a once daily antibiotic. It controls a lot of other military diseases of significance, like Q fever, for example. Anecdotally, I used to run a STI clinic at Fort Polk, and soldiers on doxycycline came to see me a lot less often for chlamydia than soldiers who weren't taking doxycycline. So doxycycline has a lot of advantages. It has a lot of benefits.
Now, does it? Because I was told that one of the drugs causes a change in a woman's menstrual cycle.
I'm sorry. I thought you were referring to things like yeast infections and so on. Doxycycline does have a number of drawbacks. It can cause erosive esophagitis in the throat. The pill can get stuck and irritate it. It can definitely disturb someone's gut flora. It can disturb a woman's vaginal flora, and so it can lead to discharge and yeast infections and that sort of thing. And it can cause sunburn. It can definitely cause sunburn. But if you're deployed overseas and it's sunny, you really should have your sleeves rolled down. And the military tells you to wear sunscreen. So that's not as much of a concern. For the most part, doxycycline is much better tolerated, certainly, than mefloquine, because, of course, 5, 10, maybe 20% of people have to stop taking doxycycline for one reason or another, at most, let's say. With mefloquine, potentially half of people need to stop taking it, right? Yeah. Because the moment you develop any insomnia, any nightmares, any anxiety, whether it's due to the drug or not, whether it's due to the fact that you're in a war zone and you're developing anxiety, you can't know if the anxiety you're experiencing is from the drug or from the environment. You can't risk misattributing it. Because if you just poo-poo the anxiety and you say, oh, well, it's because I'm getting shot at that I'm experiencing anxiety, I'm going to keep taking mefloquine, you might have just sentenced yourself to death. You might have, because that anxiety might be the only early warning sign of a developing encephalopathy that could lead to an acute psychosis so intense that you commit sudden suicide, sudden impulsive suicide. Yeah. So you can't ignore these symptoms. And because symptoms like insomnia, anxiety, depression are ubiquitous in combat zones, arguably everyone who starts taking mefloquine in a combat zone will need to stop it at some time. Yeah. So mefloquine is just, it's inherently unsuitable for use in military settings if you intend to use it in accordance with the manufacturer's directions. If you intend to ignore those directions and you want to have a drug that you can conveniently give once a week and you don't care about the health of your service members, well, then maybe it's an effective alternative. Yeah. But if you care about the health of your service members and you want to give at least lip service to doing what the drug manufacturer recommends you do, you really can't use mefloquine in military settings. Doxycycline is a much better choice. And doxycycline, the tragic thing about this is that doxycycline's always been available throughout mefloquine's availability. It was the drug of choice for areas of drug-resistant, chloroquine-resistant malaria in Africa. So doxycycline was used in Somalia to great effect. Certainly, people didn't go psychotic on doxycycline.
It was used during the time frame that we were.
Yes, of course. It was widely available. And in fact, prior to Somalia, the military mostly recommended doxycycline because it didn't have confidence in mefloquine. And many military doctors were concerned about the neuropsychiatric profile of mefloquine. And really, the Somalia campaign was used by military supporters of mefloquine and by some of the industry and government supporters of the drug to push for demonstration of the utility of this drug, the use of this drug. And it was hoped that the Somalia campaign would demonstrate the value and suitability of mefloquine. And now, of course, the military concluded that. The military erroneously concluded after Somalia that mefloquine was great for deployments, but obviously Clayton Matchey will tell you something very differently, right? Many members of the Canadian Forces will tell you, well, actually, that's not the conclusion.
24 or 28 significant incidents happened in Somalia during the time frame.
Well, of course, and that doctor, the major, wrote about the very surprising and unexpected number of neuropsychiatric events he was seeing. the tragic thing and what was missed, he missed it. Everyone missed it. General Dallaire missed this. Everyone missed it. Everyone on the front lines, the colonels, the generals, the people that should have known better, everyone missed the critical point that when you use mefloquine and you develop these symptoms, you must stop taking the drug.
Yeah.
It was in the label. It was in the warnings all along. If anyone had just, Mike, if anyone had just bothered reading the friggin' directions, if they had just read the label, and if they trusted what was written there, and you always trust what's written in those labels because those things were written by lawyers. And the lawyers are writing those things for a very particular reason, to insulate the drug company from liability. Yeah. So if you read what the instructions say and you follow the instructions, you would have known these people needed to stop taking mefloquine. And military leaders would have very quickly concluded this drug was defective for military use. But nobody read the instructions, Mike.
And most of the time, the instructions never came with the drug to the recipient.
That's true. And even if some service member had been issued the slip, right, the patient insert or the drug insert in the box, and they had brought that to their sergeant or whatever, the sergeant would have said, "Private, shut up, like get back to work." Yeah. And if the sergeant would have happened to bring that up to their captain, the captain would have said, "Sergeant, shut up, get back to work." And if the captain, I was a captain when I was in Afghanistan, I tried to bring that up to my boss, a lieutenant colonel, a colonel. What did they tell me? Dr. Nevin, Captain Nevin, shut up, get back to work, right? Yeah. Even when colonels tried to bring it up to generals, what happened? The general said, "Colonel, just shut up, go away, get back to work," right? Nobody paid attention to these instructions, right?
I think something interesting is, or my friend's wife, she became a nurse, and in becoming a nurse, she had to write a paper on something. So she did a paper on mefloquine. Uh-huh. And I think she had taken some case studies or a case study. And in the case study, it was saying that on average, now I forget what they call that, when, say, once you prescribe the drug, then for you to finish taking it, is there a certain...
Well, I think you're alluding to the concept of adherence or compliance.
Yeah, so there in the study, they said for mefloquine, only about 48.5% of the people actually took the medication to the end.
Oh, I see. Right.
Where, say, doxycycline was at 78%.
Yeah. Well, so you're alluding to an important point here. So if you're in the military and you're prescribed mefloquine, you're typically ordered to take the drug, right? So somebody will typically say, "Hey, soldier, you must take this drug every week."
Yep.
And if you're not taking it every week, we're going to have a formation and we're going to watch you take it. So non-compliance or non-adherence is not an option. And even if, let's use the example, even if the private given this drug were to read the instructions and were to focus on that line that said, if you take this drug and you develop symptoms of anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion, you must stop taking the drug. Let's say the private paid attention to that, which is unlikely because it was buried in a bunch of other text. But let's just say this private was particularly attuned to these things, very intelligent, probably should be a general, and read this and brought this to the attention of their supervisor, sergeant or whoever. Very likely the sergeant would say, "Private, shut up, take the pill." Right? And we know this happened time and time and time again. What happened to Andrew Pagani, right? He was floridly psychotic from his use of mefloquine, and nobody recognized it.
Yeah.
Nobody recognized it. So of course, nobody out in the field, with very few exceptions, is going to be permitted to stop taking this drug in the event that they develop these symptoms. They would have to be essentially floridly psychotic, like Pagani, and then they might be evacuated, and then eventually the drug will be stopped. How many times has a military medic or a military doctor accurately recognized mefloquine poisoning in the field before it became florid, before it manifested as psychotic behavior, suicidal behavior, homicidal behavior? Very infrequently. But we know that 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50% or more of veterans who take this drug, or military service members who take this drug in the field, will experience a symptom from the drug that requires it be discontinued. Not to mention all the others who will experience these symptoms for other reasons who still should stop taking the drug. Okay, so the adherence to mefloquine in certain military environments will be 100% because the sergeant will ensure it, right? So military use of mefloquine is very different than civilian use of mefloquine. In civilian settings, if you're taking mefloquine and you're going to a nice beach vacation in Tanzania, and you're sitting there on the beach looking out at the Indian Ocean, white sands, relaxing, you got music in the background, you're sipping Mai Tais on the beach, life is good, and you suddenly start feeling a little paranoid, and you've never had any sort of mental health problems in the past, and then you start having crazy dreams, and you're feeling anxious and panicky for no reason, and there's absolutely no reason to feel this way, provided you have good insight, provided the paranoia is not getting the best of you. You might realize, wait a second, something's going on. And hopefully a fellow traveler will say, hey, you look a little snippy today. You're not taking mefloquine by any chance, are you? Like, hopefully another traveler will point out, hey, maybe you should, stop taking the mefloquine, which happens all the time among travelers. So it's much more likely that a civilian traveler will not only be in a position to recognize these early prodromal effects, but that they'll be actually able to act on them. They'll actually be able to stop taking the drug. First of all, they're at a hotel, so there's no real risk of malaria. They can probably stop taking the drug and stay indoors in air conditioning for a few days, worst case scenario, right? Or they can just go home, right? So travelers are much better able to abide by these product insert directions. They might be more familiar with them. They might be less likely to misattribute symptoms to their environment rather than to the drug. So this is why I think we see relatively fewer of these permanent cases of disability from use of the drug among civilian travelers. Now, things that might change that would be, for example, were you a member of the Peace Corps? Were you basically ordered by the Peace Corps to take the drug, right? Or did you just not know? Did you never learn anything about this? Did you take the drug early on before there was widespread recognition of this? Did you believe the nonsense coming out of Schlegenhoff and other authors that you must just be crazy or, you must just be stressed from your travel? If you believed any of this nonsense, you might continue to take the drug, right? Or you might just have a bad doctor, right? As many cases I've been involved with, the doctor said, "Don't worry about this. This is fine. You might have bad dreams. You might have some anxiety. Don't worry about it. Keep taking it." Just blatant, pure malpractice, because that's not the way you're supposed to use the drug. So depending on all of these factors, you may be more or less likely to discontinue the drug or use it as directed. But regardless, on average, the military is going to be much more prone to continued use of the drug after the onset of these prodromal symptoms. And we think that but you're supposed to stop taking the drug immediately if you experience these prodromal symptoms. Now, if you take 1 or 2 extra doses, is the damage going to be worse? What if you take 5 more doses or 10 more doses? Then you asked early about cumulative effect.
Yeah.
So in this case, I do think that once prodromal symptoms have manifested, once you've demonstrated a personal susceptibility to mefloquine, then I do think cumulative subsequent exposure does matter. So if you stop taking the drug right away after the onset of prodromal symptoms, whatever damage has been done hopefully won't get much worse. It might get a little worse, but hopefully it won't get much worse. But then if you take another pill and then another pill, you're just adding fuel to the fire. The drug has been demonstrated to be neurotoxic and harmful in your particular case. And so by adding more and more doses to your cumulative total, you're probably doing more and more severe damage and probably increasing the type of damage that you do. So potentially maybe the first symptoms are just vivid dreams and anxiety. Maybe the drug's only affecting your limbic system, your hippocampus. But then you take additional doses of the drug. Perhaps now it's starting to affect your brainstem, right? And then you take more and more, and perhaps now you have a very severe seizure disorder as a result of that. So cumulative dose might be a factor once susceptibility has been demonstrated through prodromal symptoms.
And which, with that, like say in Somalia or, the first, even the troops that deployed to Afghanistan in 2001 or 2002 with 3 PPCLI, they were forced to take the drug whether they had whether they had side effects or not.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So then, say Scott Smith, who took his life in Rwanda.
Okay. Right. Yep. I'm familiar with that.
He took it in Somalia, and then when he was going to go back to Rwanda, he was telling his mother he didn't want to go. He was having hallucinations. He didn't want to have. So then, having taken that drug every week after he was having all the problems,
Right.
only made it worse.
I think so. I think a reasonable argument could be made that once susceptibility has been established through the development of prodromal symptoms, then every additional dose of that drug, whether you're taking it because you're just unaware, or in his case because you were ordered to, that is an example of involuntary intoxication. He is being forcibly poisoned by the military. It's as if he was held down and the military poured bottles of vodka down his throat. He's being involuntarily intoxicated.
Yeah.
And many of these awful cases that we hear about, whether it's Bales or Clayton Matchey or Scott Smith, these represent very obvious cases of involuntary intoxication. They were ordered into madness. The military ordered them to take this pill that they should have known was making these people crazy.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, it's a tremendous injustice. And of course, their excuse was, well, we didn't know.
Yeah. But in reality, should they not have known, say, even for when Mefloquine come out, would they not have known that some of these symptoms were going to
I think so. I think, given the military's key driving role in the development of this drug, that the U.S. military knew, or certainly ought to have known, of these effects. Now, this was known at a very high level. Whether this was known at lower levels is of course, to be determined on a case-by-case basis. But arguably, Mike, I think the most plausible. Well, let's take a step back. Many people ask me, they say, "How did this happen? How did this happen?" And because this doesn't make any sense, right? How could something so dangerous have been permitted to be used for so long?
Yep.
And I don't know for certain, but I'm increasingly drawn to the conclusion that this was all intentional.
Yep.
That these effects were not only known, but were actually deemed by some very sick and deranged people to be desirable.
Yeah, desired effects.
Well, I think we were talking about insomnia and how many Mefloquine veterans have this uncanny ability to stay awake and drive for 12, 16, 18 hours at a stretch.
22?
22, right. Okay. So let's just think about this. So many Mefloquine veterans will develop this ability to be able to drive for a very long time. And they might not be in the best of shape, but they get from point A to point B okay. All right, let's just put that observation aside. Many Mefloquine veterans will report that they have a heightened perception of danger. They see danger and threat where other people probably wouldn't see it. And very often, that perceived sense of threat manifests as directed actions towards that threat. They might get mad at it. They might get feelings like they want to do something about it. In some cases, in some very extreme cases, they might pick up their gun and they might point it at the thing and they might shoot it.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so let's just take that observation and put it aside.
Yeah.
Right? Certainly, a greater level of environmental situational awareness, right? Shorter sleep, anger, agitation, aggression.
Yep.
Mother Teresa could take Mefloquine, and if she started having nightmares and insomnia, very soon she might experience homicidal rage. Mother Teresa on Mefloquine might not be Mother Teresa anymore. She might actually be prompted to kill, right?
Yep.
Now, what's the single biggest problem militaries have with conscript armies? What's the single biggest problem militaries have had through history with conscript armies?
Would that go towards that book on killing?
Soldiers don't want to kill.
Yeah.
They found in the Civil War that many of the troops that had been killed, they should have fired a shot. They didn't fire a shot. Their muskets still had a loaded round. In Vietnam, soldiers were shooting over the heads of the enemy all the time. Why? Because they hadn't been properly motivated to kill. And the military hates this, right? You might have been, a God-fearing, well-behaved high school kid, but we need to turn you within 3 to 6 months into a cold-blooded killer. You need to kill anyone we tell you to kill. That's like the key step in socializing someone into the military. And it's very difficult to do this. Some people take to it a little more naturally than other people, let's admit, but many people have a difficult time wanting, not just doing it, but actually wanting to kill other people. How could we possibly make soldiers more apt to kill on our behalf? Wouldn't it be great if we could just sprinkle some chemical into their food that would make them more agitated? Well, if we did that, if we gave them a killing solution, if we developed some drug that made them into super soldiers, right, and we marketed it as super soldier juice or whatever, that would probably not be taken very well.
Not be seen very well.
The public would have problems with that, right? But what if, and just hear me out here, this is all purely hypothetical, theoretical. What if there was a drug or a class of drugs that has been known to militaries for the better part of a century that completely coincidentally, Mike, just had this convenient set of side effects, including inducing insomnia, restlessness, agitation, paranoia, and a desire to kill. That just conveniently happen to align with the main interests of the military. Let's just say such a drug class existed. And let's just say, conveniently, that this drug also had a plausible application other than
what you want.
Yes. Let's just say you had to give it to soldiers when they were deployed because they were deploying to areas where there was this big, dangerous thing called malaria. So you had to give them this pill. And most people didn't have familiarity with this medicine, but soldiers going overseas would take it quite a bit. Wouldn't that be convenient? Let's say you were a terrible person in charge of the military and you came across this miraculous drug that you could say was being given for protection against malaria, but also conveniently had this incidental property that in 20, 30, 40, 50% of your troops, it made them a little more anxious, a little more restless, able to do with just a little less sleep, and on occasion turned them into really cold-blooded killers. Let's just say there was such a drug. Would you deploy that drug? I think most generals would. I think the people sitting around the halls of sitting around the conference,
they have a mission to accomplish, and that's the main goal.
I mean, you have to think about things in context. We're talking about a group of people that are actively planning the deployment of nuclear weapons. These people have the future of humanity in their hands. If winning a war, right, if getting 20, 30, 40% of the troops a little more anxious, a little more paranoid, a little more apt to kill, if telling a little lie and deploying a drug as an anti-malarial that everyone knows is going to actually help the war cause a little bit. And whatever the harms are, whatever, big deal. This is war. People die. Right? I mean, doesn't that seem like a rational choice for leaders to make? I think it does. I think it does. I think if folks at the Pentagon or folks at the White House or the folks at the CIA that actually run everything, as we all know, if these people were presented with such a drug, they would say, execute, let's do this. And they might even come up with a special code name for drugs of this type. Oh, and by the way, what if you can also give this drug to terrorists and detainees that you just happen to catch? And if you can give it with, pretext at higher doses and reliably use that as an adjunct to torture, that would just be another incidental benefit, right? Now, of course, to use the drug under those conditions, to be able to plausibly use the drug in a place like Guantanamo as an adjunct to torture, it would be nice if you could also continue to give it to your troops, because then you could say, well, no, there's nothing dangerous about this drug. We're not using this drug to torture detainees. This drug is so safe and well tolerated, we even give it to our troops.
Yeah.
Do you see how nefarious this all gets?
Yeah.
Very quickly. But looking at it from the perspective of a group of people who are charged with protecting our national security, who routinely do all sorts of terrible things, right?
Yeah.
Killing babies, killing elected leaders, influencing elections, doing God knows what, these intelligence agencies and people at the Pentagon do. I mean, these people do terrible things, supposedly for our benefit.
Yeah.
Does this rank anywhere near the top of crazy or terrible things that they have done or might do in the future? No, this is child's play. This is amateur stuff.
Yeah.
This is well within the realm of possibility. So this is the conclusion that I have, quite regrettably come to as being the most logical explanation for how this drug has been permitted to be used for so long. They knew all along, and it was intentional. And at some point, maybe they dropped the need for this drug. Maybe they decided, you know what, this project, whatever, it's not. But then, you know what, the truth never came out. It's not like they said, hey, by the way, we developed this drug as as an instrument of psychological control. We probably shouldn't have you guys use it. No, of course they're not going to say that. Of course the drug is going to continue to be used. And the folks that use it today have no idea of this questionable past. Now, I know this sounds crazy, but if you study this drug as I have, this is the only conclusion you come to. And here's where this gets very disturbing. And perhaps we can end it at this, because now we've gone all the way down the rabbit hole, and there's not really much more to talk about. So I'm sure you're familiar with, and we're going here, by the way. So I'm sure you're familiar with MKUltra. I'm sure you're familiar with this with this historically proven series of experiments that the CIA did on mind control, basically, and they used all sorts of things. They used LSD. LSD is what Project MKUltra is mostly known for. CIA giving unwitting civilians LSD to see how the people behaved, with the idea that we might be able to protect our own people from being interrogated, or we might be able to assist other people in interrogation. Right. Well, actually, that was the project of a later CIA effort called MK Search. But MK Search evolved from MKUltra, which was more general. It was just looking into ways of controlling people's minds, whether for offensive or defensive purposes. That project emerged from a few other projects that had taken place in prior years. But do you know what the original source of the CIA's interest in using drugs for this purpose was? Do you know what the original source of interest was? This came out during the church hearings. So the church committee was this sunshine committee that was looking into all sorts of weird things going on at the CIA. Now, the church committee hearings were actually taking place during Mefloquine's development, so keep that in mind. But the CIA was basically coming clean and admitting to all the nefarious things it had done in the past, most likely to hide other nefarious things it wasn't talking about that it was still doing. But let's just put that aside for a moment. And one of the folks who testified at those hearings was a fellow named Dr. Geschichter. And he had run a lab at Georgetown during the MKUltra experiments. And he plainly said, and this is in the transcript of the hearings, he basically said the origin of the CIA's interest in using drugs for this purpose was the recognition during World War II that certain anti-malarial drugs that were in development had these very interesting, unusual effects on people's behavior. And it ends up that drugs very closely related to mefloquine, chloroquine, adabrine, or quinoline drugs, as they were being tested during World War II in the hopes of finding another anti-malarial. And this is the project that led to chloroquine's development, by the way. But as they were testing many of these quinoline drugs, they found in test subjects that many became psychotic and developed this paranoid, delusional, persecutory psychosis, or an acute confusional psychosis. Now, of course, the CIA wasn't established yet, but the OSS was, the Office of Special Strategic Services, right? And they took an interest in this. And based on some documents I've been able to find, I do think that these effects, these psychotic-inducing effects, were exploited by OSS during the European campaign. They ordered large amounts of adabrine. And the reasons for their ordering large amounts of adabrine during World War II is not entirely clear. Of course, they're never going to admit in writing, we want to make some people go crazy. But I suspect they were exploiting adabrine's effects for strategic purposes. And so they looked, I think what they recognized was that this class of drug had this fantastic potential application because there was a plausible reason to give people this drug in war zones. It's an anti-malarial. We're trying to help you. But they also knew that under certain circumstances, and maybe they know more about it than even we do. Maybe there's a combination of drugs you can give that heightens this effect or brings it about in all people so that it's not just a random sort of effect. I mean, if anyone knows, they know. I think they realized, hey, this is potentially very useful. This is a useful addition to our toolkit. We can say that we're trying to help them. We can say that we're trying to stop malaria. And we can also make them go crazy, and we might be able to interrogate them, or we might be able to use these effects for, I don't know, some military purpose or something. So I'm fairly convinced that from the time of the CIA's founding, they were looking into the behavioral effects of the quinoline drugs, and that the development of chloroquine, the deployment of chloroquine and primaquine was done with the full knowledge that these drugs had these psychotropic effects. And I'm convinced that the development of mefloquine was also initially motivated to some extent by a desire to use this drug for reasons other than purely as an anti-malarial. And I mentioned during the church hearings, mefloquine was being developed. What better way to distract people from the possibility that you're developing yet another MK search or MKUltra type drug than just admitting to everything you've done, and then people will assume you're not doing anything more. So from all the evidence I reviewed, this is the most logical explanation for everything. How is it that we have documentary evidence establishing the CIA's interest in quinoline drugs, specific anti-malarial quinolines, specifically for their behavioral effects? You have 20, 30 years of intelligence community research into this, ending precisely when mefloquine is developed and deployed. That is more than coincidence. That, to me, suggests that mefloquine was the inevitable follow-on to this effort that had since been stopped.
And didn't they, when they shut down, say, the MKUltra stuff, didn't they then open up the office for anti-malaria studies or something like that?
So the timing is very coincidental. It coincides almost perfectly. So the documentation that's been released from CIA says, well, MKUltra doesn't work. It just makes, LSD not a good idea. But they did say, but with the exception of one particular application, with the exception of one particular type of drug, we're going to abandon these efforts. These efforts will continue under a program called MK Search, which started in the 70s, which is around the time of mefloquine's development. It was the late 60s, early 70s that mefloquine started to be developed. So the timing coincides very well. And the Army, of course, took ostensibly the lead in this effort. It was the Army that was developing this drug because it was worried about chloroquine resistance and so on. But I think they were just looking for a better chloroquine. I think they were looking for a drug that had more reliable effects in this regard. And they found it with mefloquine. Now, mefloquine, we think it was synthesized. The first reported synthesis of mefloquine is in 1969. But I'm not entirely convinced we hadn't synthesized it earlier before, because many drugs chemically very similar to mefloquine were actually synthesized and explored during the World War II era effort. And it wouldn't have been that difficult, even if mefloquine wasn't precisely synthesized. Drugs so chemically similar to mefloquine, we're talking off by a couple atoms, had been developed that they could have easily developed it and simply not listed it. Yeah. So it's entirely possible mefloquine was under development in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and they just decided to deploy it, operationalize it in the 70s.
Now, when was the My Lai incident? That was in March of, was that 69?
Well, I'm not sure, and I have been contacted by some. I think where you're going with this. Some veterans have contacted me to say that they were given mefloquine earlier than it had been reportedly been available. Yeah. So I can't rule out the possibility that mefloquine may have been used throughout the 70s and 80s on occasion. But the My Lai incident you're referring to, well, more generally, I can't rule out the possibility that much of what we considered Vietnam syndrome back in the day, and which led to the recognition of PTSD as a diagnosis, wasn't actually in large part the effects of chloroquine and primaquine together, or other quinoline drugs that were being deployed experimentally for treatment of malaria. Many, if you review the the literature from that era, you'd be very surprised because it really doesn't look anything like PTSD. It looks much more like quinoline encephalopathy. And the people who are experiencing it, in some cases, there's discussion of these people having been treated for malaria and then coming home radically different, and this being attributed to the cerebral effects of malaria, which is a bunch of hokey. That's ridiculous. Something else happened that resulted in these cognitive and psychiatric effects. And so it very well could have been experimental use of mefloquine. It could have been experimental use of other quinoline drugs. So the origins of post-traumatic stress disorder, I think, will need to be disentangled in due course.
Yeah.
And of course, look, I hate to say this, but if the government is behind all of this, if the government said, all right, let's throw another wrench in the works, let's make sure they don't discover the harmful effects of chloroquine and mefloquine, let's call it PTSD and keep them busy for 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the diagnosis of PTSD only came about because of coordinated action and approval by the American Psychiatric Association working with DOD and the VA. There were discussions held at a very high level that ultimately led to this being accepted. Before this, the psychiatric community didn't want to have anything to do with this idea. It was very sudden. It suggests some degree of coordination. Now, is this actually what happened? Was PTSD just a psyop to get us not focused on the effects, the psychological effects, the psychiatric effects of quinoline drugs used in wartime? Even that might be a little too preposterous. But is it completely out of the realm of possibility? It's not. It's not completely out of the realm of possibility. All of this is going to need to be explored and re-examined. If we re-examine the history of how this disorder came to be recognized and in what populations this disorder was initially recognized, what we're going to find is we're going to find the fingerprints of the government and the military all over this.
Yep.
And of course, why not? Because this dealt with veterans from the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
But if my theory is even partly correct, even if there's a small shred of correctness in this theory, then it hopelessly contaminates the history of post-traumatic stress disorder research. It's all going to have to be looked at anew.
Yeah.
As I've suggested. Yeah. It now, is this preposterous? Is this unbelievable? Like in the ranking of all incredible things that we're learning about our government, where does this rank? It probably doesn't even crack the top 5, does it? Right?
Oh, I think if we knew the full story, it would.
I think even if we knew the full story, it probably wouldn't even crack the top 5.
Oh yeah,
okay. Surprising.
If we knew of all the other stuff.
What I'm saying is that the you don't really have to reach too far to conclude that this is not beyond the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
And it's like Occam's razor suggests we do. You want to find the simplest, most parsimonious, simple explanation for things. And while a vast government conspiracy is generally not the most parsimonious explanation, there are some occasions where actually it is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like you see a funny looking aircraft flying overhead and no one knows anything about it. Well, actually, it's been under construction at the Skunk Works in a desert in Nevada for 20 years. And it actually does exist. That's actually the most logical explanation. Right? So this is similar. This is similar. There might be some Skunk Works that's been at work here in the background, trying to influence how our militaries behave on deployment. And was it completely nefarious? Was this completely ridiculous? Perhaps it was done with good intentions. Maybe they thought we needed a drug that had these effects.
The good intentions part, I don't buy that one.
Well, the road to HE double hockey sticks is paved with good intentions. Yeah. And I think that may be the case.
And I think that the Miley incident is a good example to use of what a drug could do, because how do you explain everybody that was on the ground there were on a killing spree, and the only person that tried to stop anything was the helicopter pilot flying overhead that then landed and tried to talk sense into them, and then instead he was blackballed and ridiculed and put down, and right.
Well, so I have to admit, I don't know the detail. I actually haven't looked into that incident with reference to this theory of mine. And there are numerous plausible explanations for mass acts of violence like that.
Okay.
As we've seen in recent years, mass psychosis is a thing.
Yeah.
You can have mass formation psychosis induced very easily, which I think many people are still suffering from, but that's another story.
Yeah.
But there are numerous explanations for this. Whether this is the most likely explanation in any individual case obviously requires an analysis of the facts and circumstances. And so with the Bales case, for example, it really does hinge on certain key pieces of evidence. You can't just see a mass killing and say, oh, well, that must be Mefloquine. You have it has to make sense. And of course, in the Bales case, the critical aspect of the Bales case is that his action was very explicitly, very clearly motivated by his misperceiving a benign stimulus. It may not, the lights were probably not even there. They weren't even there. So this was a hallucination, a psychosis, fueled by persecutory delusions and paranoia that led to his taking what he thought was rational action. So perhaps there are similar set of circumstances we could identify in melee and so on. And it's not the case that every bad thing that's ever happened in a war zone is necessarily due to this, but it needs to be explored. And a perfect example of that, and perhaps we can end on this because, of course, you're from Canada and with the airborne, is the case of Clayton Matchey, right? The Clayton Matchey case that led to the what's known as the Somalia affair, that led to the disbanding of the Canadian Airborne Regiment. In retrospect, the facts are clear. And why the Canadian government doesn't acknowledge this, because it's so plainly obvious. This is beyond me. But it's plainly obvious what happened. The Canadian government procured a large quantity of Lariam or Mefloquine illegally through abuse and manipulation of a clinical trial that was not intended for this purpose. Didn't provide any appropriate safety warnings to all the troops. Clayton Matchey among them, who started taking Mefloquine under orders, had no opportunity to discontinue the drug, wouldn't have even known to discontinue the drug because he was never given any safety directions. Goes overseas, begins to hallucinate, experiences symptoms of psychosis, goes home apparently on leave. He's in bed with his wife. He awakens in a sweat, seeing this horrific goblin creature at the foot of his bed. He starts praying to God to save him from this creature. Wakes his wife up. Marge is praying with him to try to get rid of this evil spirit. All of this eludes the attention of his commanders. He goes back over to Somalia. He's in a pit with Shadena Roan, one of the captives. He starts hallucinating the presence of camel spiders. He sees camel spiders everywhere. There are no camel spiders, but he's perceiving the presence of camel spiders. He takes a baton. He starts whacking the camel spiders. And then eventually he starts whacking Shadena Roan. Not because he had any animus or ill will towards Shadena Roan, at least not more than any soldier had for any Somali at the time. The reason he beat him into a pulp was because he was laboring under these persecutory delusions and hallucinations, and he was seeing monsters and creatures, and the poor man was out of his mind. And rather than and of course, later on, perhaps realizing what he had done, because insight is preserved in this condition. Typically, he, as far as we know, attempted to hang himself, and of course, he's still alive. Right? He has permanent brain damage. He's really not aware of what's going on. But all of this is the direct fault of the Canadian government and their gross, negligent misuse of this drug. Their failure to recognize his symptoms for what they were, as symptoms of psychosis caused by the drug. And then they had the nerve to blame all of this on the soldiers instead of the top brass that broke the law administering this drug. They had the nerve to do this and disband the Canadian Airborne Regiment. And those people that were responsible for this continued to work for the government, collected their pensions. They're probably retired now, enjoying a good life, while Shadena Roan is dead. Clayton Matchey is being cared for by his family.
Shadow of himself.
And hundreds of Canadian veterans who proudly served in the airborne had to live with this false disgrace that the Canadian government forced upon them for something which wasn't their fault. And and as tragic as the story of the Canadian Airborne Regiment is and the Somalia affairs, as tragic as this is, and as terrible as an abuse of authority as this represents, and as awful as it is that these leaders continue to hide behind these ridiculous stories and don't fess up to the truth, as awful as all of this is but one of dozens and dozens and dozens of similar incidents all around the world in various jurisdictions, whether it's the UK, Ireland, Canada, United States, other allied Western nations, not to mention the burden of disability this drug has caused in other contexts for use in the developing world and so on. When the final tally is done, when the final toll is calculated, who knows, how bad this will be? But I imagine it'll be far worse than any of us could have even conceived.
Yeah, I agree. And in Somalia, bar none, the drug made us more aggressive.
Yeah.
Right.
Perhaps it was working as intended.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I think so. It was. Nobody really wants to talk about it, right?
No.
They didn't want to talk about it because, say, well, I'll give you an example. Say I was telling Dave from the recording studio, saying how, when I went from a regular infantry battalion and I went to the airborne regiment, the thing that kind of shocked me, we did a live fire exercise. At the end of the shooting, we cleared our weapons.
Yeah.
And then we're standing there waiting for the warrant to come check on us. And it's like, hey, warrant, you going to come check our weapons? And he's like, well, are they clear? It's like, well, of course they're clear, warrant. He's like, well, then fucking clear it. So then we cleared our weapons, and I was like, man, you're treated like a man here with all these responsibilities, do all this stuff, right?
Yep.
But then you took that high level of professionalism, and when we went to Somalia, people were all over the fucking place.
I imagine.
Right? People were bad decisions. My section commander took us down a mined road. So when I came back, looked at the map at the int place.
Yeah.
Oh, we went through a minefield. Perfect. Right. Things like that.
Yeah.
But there was no.
Yeah, you can't make little mistakes like that in combat, and of course, that those sorts of effects were alluded to in the original product insert when they said, well, you shouldn't operate heavy equipment, and you shouldn't operate any sort of machinery that requires fine motor control. Well, that's pretty much everything in the military. Last time I checked, firing a rifle requires fine motor control.
Yeah.
Now, of course, these are not the most important warnings, right? This is incidental, but it just indicates, this is another example of how these important warnings were just completely overlooked, and how fundamentally this drug, despite the theories that we've explored about all of this being intentional, how if we just look at what the product insert says and we ignore the potential for all of this having been intentional, if we look at the product insert, we can very clearly conclude right away, this drug is not suitable for military use. And if Mefloquine was developed primarily for military use, based on what's in the product insert, it is fundamentally defective for that indication. It really should have been discarded right away. And of course, my theory is that the reason it wasn't discarded right away, when evidence of this fundamental defective nature was clearly identified, my theory is that the reason it wasn't discarded was because they had no desire to discard it. They wanted it for those purposes. Again, this is all speculative. I don't think we're going to get the former head of the CIA or some former head of the State Department or the DOD saying, yep, all along, this is what we wanted. We wanted to make our soldiers just a little more, antsy so that we could, win in Vietnam. That's the next Vietnam. That's you're never going to hear that from anyone.
And in Somalia, there was a lot of talk about the CIA being there.
Well, there's
about
everywhere.
them coming in,
They're
right?
Of course, and that's not me being paranoid. The CIA
dropping off money, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, of course that's what they're doing. Of course that's what they're doing. That's why they exist. So I think the history of this drug can't be properly understood without an understanding of MKUltra, MK Search, the various projects that preceded those, going back to the World War II era and the OSS interest in this drug, all of which is very clearly documented on the record by someone who knows, someone who is involved in this. And I think that's authoritative. So all of this needs to be understood. And only once you understand that history, up to and including the drugs used by CIA and the military, most likely CIA, in Guantanamo. You have to understand all of this context. Once you understand that, and you get beyond the idea that this is just some crazy conspiracy theory, because all of this did happen.
Yeah.
All of this did happen. The intelligence agencies were very interested in this class of drug for its behavioral effects, and they did almost certainly use this drug to torture people in Guantanamo.
Yeah.
There's almost no other explanation
Disputing it.
for it. It's very difficult to dispute. The only other explanation is just pure and utter incompetence, and you don't see pure and utter incompetence at those levels. You don't.
No.
They might pretend to be incompetent, but that's all intentional.
Yeah.
So once you understand this series of historical facts that the highest levels of government, including the intelligence agencies, have been very interested in and have knowingly exploited the behavioral effects of these drugs. Only once you understand that can you put the military's use of these drugs in context.
Yeah.
And when you wonder, why did the military continue to use this drug after all of these warnings, after they should have known it was dangerous? Well, then you'll have your answer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a little bit more, because if there's this big controversy, if there's this big, for lack of a better term, conspiracy, there are all these other little offshoots, that come from that, and most of them are pretty banal and rather predictable, but they are interesting in their own right, and it continues today with the development of some new drugs like the Mefloquine is a whole other story.
I really can't thank you enough for taking the time to spend and to talk and
My pleasure. This has been
share
great.
with us.
Yeah. And thank you for driving. You drove all the way out here from Newfoundland. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that. That is, for those who don't know geography on the East Coast, that is a significant drive.
Yeah.
That's many days driving that you took there to come here. So I appreciate it. And hopefully folks will want to come here to Michigan for future meetings of our association. As we were talking about before, we're having one final meeting of the Quineism Foundation in Vermont at our usual time, the last Monday of April. So we're going to have our final meeting there. Wish Vermont goodbye. Who knows? Maybe the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder will show up this time.
Yes.
And we can teach them all about this stuff. But I'm not getting my hopes up. We'll get to them eventually. And hopefully folks will find it may be more convenient to attend meetings here in the Michigan area. We might hold meetings here at the St.Clair Inn, where we are on the
Beautiful area.
beautiful shores of the St.Clair River. Or we may hold our meetings in Port Huron, right across the bridge from Sarnia. We might even be able to hold meetings in Sarnia and Port Huron for a small number of folks that can't cross the border for understandable reasons.
For whatever reason.
Or we may just have a meeting about an hour down the road in Detroit by the airport, so folks can fly into Detroit from wherever and then just take a shuttle to a conference at the airport. We'll figure it out. We might ask around and see what's most convenient. But I'm looking forward to welcoming folks to Michigan at some point in the future.
Yeah. Come out and get the T-shirt. I got the one from the Hotel Coolidge, is it?
Yeah, the Hotel Coolidge. The final time we'll have our meeting at the Hotel Coolidge is April 29th and 30th of this year. We hold our final meeting there. Yeah.
And I mean, I went last year, and it was really incredible information getting it, right?
Nice.
I mean,
well, if you can endure listening to me talk for 4 hours, you're halfway there. You can listen to me talk for 8 hours. During our conference.
all easy listening.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. Definitely appreciate all the work and effort that you put into all of this. And if it really, if it wasn't for you, we would be a lot further off from anywhere.
I'm not sure. Right? Darwin, he developed the theory of evolution. He published The Origin of Species. And there was some other guy, I forget his name, but he was basically working on the same thing. And I don't think he had published his stuff because he knew Darwin was working on it. So there's probably someone else that's working on this.
Yeah.
And they're letting me carry all the weight and, go on record saying crazy things like this is all a conspiracy theory. So there's probably other people that are certainly involved in this kind of work, but we just don't hear from them.
But the unfortunate part is it's not really crazy what's being said, because it's all backed by data. information.
Yeah, but my point is, I think if I hadn't joined the U.S. military, if I'd stayed in Canada and I don't know, been a pipeline engineer or something like I was,
our
thinking
lives
of doing,
might all been a lot different.
no, I don't think so. I think someone else would have probably done a lot of the work that I'm doing. That's the way science works. The way science works is funny. We think it hinges on the individual contributions of key people, but key people emerge. What are seen as key people, they emerge because the evidence has risen to a certain point, and it's like they say, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And I think had I not done a lot of work in this area, someone else invariably would have, because the condition was ripe for work of this nature. And would it have happened right away? It might have taken 5 or 10 more years. It might have, but I think eventually the process would have been the same. And arguably, if it was someone else other than me, we might have made more progress. Because I'm fairly well educated. I'm pretty intelligent. There's plenty more smart people out there than me, and they might have been in a position to advance this a little bit better than me. So you're kind of stuck with me, Mike, but hopefully I did good.
Now I should ask you one final question, because I didn't. We know that you took Mefloquine, correct?
I did. Yeah.
Now where are you for symptoms?
I don't know,
effects,
and I've been asked this, and I don't want, because I'm a good doctor for other people, but I'm a terrible doctor for myself.
Yeah.
I don't have objectivity when it comes to my own symptoms. No doctor does. They fool themselves if they think they do. So I would need someone else to evaluate me and my history and determine if I'm affected. Now I can tell you, when I was taking Mefloquine, I had the best dreams, Mike. I was a rock star. I was living the life of Mick Jagger or whatever. I was having, my dreams were pleasant. I looked forward to sleeping. It was the only thing that was entertaining in Afghanistan. What else was there to do in Bagram, Afghanistan? So I enjoyed my dreams because every day was this new Technicolor adventure. And I would go all sorts of interesting places and meet all sorts of interesting people. And they were happy, good dreams. I enjoyed them immensely. They weren't nightmares in the least. Now, was I affected at all? I mean, I was in Afghanistan. Of course, I was kind of miserable. I missed my girlfriend. I missed my home in Baltimore. I missed lots of things. And I was just grumpy. And to what extent was that the drug? And what effect was that of the circumstances? I don't know. But what does this reinforce? It reinforces that how is someone to obey these directions, right? I mean, should I have stopped the drug because I had all these symptoms? Yeah, I probably should have. Did I recognize it at the time? No, I only recognized that in retrospect. So if Dr. Nevin, who some people say is the world's leading authority on Mefloquine poisoning, couldn't even figure out himself if he should have stopped taking Mefloquine while he was overseas, what hope is there for anyone else?
But then technically you have too many answers that you can give yourself to every side effect.
Of course,
right?
You can rationalize
as a doctor. You can
rationalize your right. And this is the danger of Mefloquine. I mean, it really is amazing that as many people stop the drug as do, right? Because there's many ways to rationalize the symptoms you're experiencing. But I suppose more germanely, did I experience any permanent adverse effects from the drug? I don't think so. Well, with the exception of persistent tinnitus, which I do think actually is due to the drug. I'll get someone to independently evaluate that in due course. But other than that, I don't know. I think I'm of pretty reasonable temperament. I don't think I have any. Well, that depends who you ask. I think I'm doing okay. Yeah. And that's not unexpected, right? Not everyone who takes the drug is going to experience permanent disability. And actually, I did stop taking the drug quite soon. I'm not sure how many weeks, maybe within a month or two, I stopped taking the drug because I realized, well, first of all, there's no malaria here, and I can easily deal with any residual risk quite safely. And also, by that point, by the time I decided to stop taking the drug, I'd realized that this was a problem, right? It was around the time that I was realizing something funny is going on here that I stopped taking the drug. So was it a month or 2 or 3? I don't know. It's all a blur in retrospect. But I certainly didn't. I wasn't taking it when I came home from Afghanistan. That's for sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you. Being on the podcast. Yeah, appreciate it.